Daniel Hayes stood frozen in the break room, coffee cup trembling in his hand, as Elena Vaughn, the youngest billionaire CEO in Chicago, stared at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Was this recognition? Suspicion? Something else entirely? He had lied on his application. He knew it. She knew it. And now, just 3 days into the job that was supposed to save his daughter's future, he was certain he was about to lose everything. But what happened next would shatter every assumption he'd made about power, ambition, and the dangerous line between professional scrutiny and something far more personal. Want to see how this impossible situation unfolds? Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far Daniel's story travels across the world. The fluorescent lights of the Chicago Transit Authority bus flickered as Daniel Hayes pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching the city skyline emerge from the pre-dawn darkness. It was 4:47 a.m., and he'd been awake since 3, running through the same mental checklist he'd memorized over the past 72 hours. Project terminology, corporate hierarchy, the names and faces of people who lived in a world he'd only glimpsed from the outside. His daughter Maya had still been asleep when he'd left their studio apartment in Bridgeport, her small body curled beneath the donated comforter covered in faded unicorns. She was 7 now, and for the past 3 years it had been just the two of them against a world that seemed designed to keep people like Daniel exactly where they'd started. But 3 days ago, something impossible had happened. Daniel Hayes, high school graduate, former warehouse worker, single father with a criminal record he'd spent 6 years trying to outrun, had been hired by Vaughn Meridian Consulting, one of the most prestigious firms in the Midwest. The email had arrived at 11:34 p.m., just as he was preparing to delete his application and accept that he'd aimed too high, reached too far. Dear Mr. Hayes, we are pleased to offer you the position of Junior Strategic Analyst. He'd read it 17 times before believing it was real. Now, as the bus lurched toward the loop, Daniel pulled out his phone and opened the photo he'd taken of Maya before leaving. She was smiling in her sleep, one hand tucked under her cheek, completely unaware that her father was about to walk into a building where his annual salary would finally, barely, cover rent, childcare, and the mountain of debt that had been crushing them since her mother left. The lie sat heavy in his chest. On his application, under Education, he'd written Bachelor of Arts, Business Administration, University of Illinois at Chicago, 2014. It wasn't true. He'd taken exactly 14 credit hours before money ran out and life got complicated. But the job posting had been clear. Bachelor's degree required. No exceptions. He'd convinced himself it was a small lie. A necessary one. He'd learned more in 3 years of managing logistics at a Southside warehouse than most business majors learned in 4 years of theory. He could do this job. He knew he could. But that didn't stop the guilt from eating him alive. The Vaughn Meridian building rose 73 stories above West Wacker Drive, all glass and steel and the kind of architectural ambition that made Daniel feel simultaneously inspired and impossibly small. He'd passed it 100 times on various bus routes, never imagining he'd actually walk through those revolving doors. Now he stood in the marble lobby at 6:15 a.m., 45 minutes before he needed to be at his desk, because being early was the only advantage he had. You're keen. Daniel turned to find a woman in her mid-50s, stylishly dressed in a charcoal pantsuit, watching him with amused curiosity. Her ID badge read, Margaret Chen, Senior Partner. First week, Daniel said, managing a smile, still figuring out timing. Smart, Margaret said, pressing the elevator button. Elena appreciates punctuality. Actually, Elena appreciates very little, but punctuality is on the list. Elena Vaughn? Daniel asked, though he already knew. Everyone knew. At 30 years old, Elena Vaughn had built Vaughn Meridian from the ground up, starting with inheritance money that she'd somehow turned into a 9-figure empire in less than a decade. Forbes had called her ruthlessly brilliant. The Wall Street Journal had used the phrase emotionally unavailable genius. Business Insider had run a profile titled The CEO Who Never Smiles. The one and only, Margaret said as the elevator doors opened. Word of advice, don't take it personally when she tears your work apart. She does it to everyone. Well, everyone she thinks is worth the effort. The comment lodged itself in Daniel's mind as he rode up to the 42nd floor, where the Strategic Analysis Division occupied a sprawling open floor plan that somehow managed to feel both collaborative and intensely competitive. His desk was in the northeast corner, positioned near a wall of windows that offered a sweeping view of the Chicago River. It was smaller than most of the other workstations, and Daniel suspected it had previously been used for storage, but it was his. He set down his worn messenger bag, purchased from a thrift store in Lincoln Park, and pulled out the notebook where he'd been tracking everything: project codes, client names, the complex web of relationships that seemed to govern how work flowed through the company. "You're here early." The voice came from behind him, and Daniel turned to find James Park, one of the other junior analysts, standing with 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep," Daniel admitted. "First week nerves?" James asked, offering him one of the cups. "Or first job nerves?" Daniel accepted the coffee, grateful for the gesture. "Is it that obvious?" "You've got that look," James said, settling against the edge of Daniel's desk. "Like you're waiting for someone to figure out you don't belong here." The accuracy of the observation made Daniel's stomach twist, but he forced himself to laugh. "That transparent, huh?" "Don't worry about it," James said. "Half the people here have imposter syndrome. The other half are actually imposters. They're just better at hiding it." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "Real talk, though? You're going to want to develop a thick skin fast, especially if you catch Elena's attention." "Why is that?" "Because she doesn't waste time on people she's written off," James said. "If she's ignoring you, you're safe but irrelevant. If she's paying attention," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Let's just say her attention is not comfortable." Before Daniel could respond, a subtle shift occurred in the office atmosphere. Conversations quieted. People straightened in their chairs. Daniel felt it before he understood it, the arrival of someone whose presence changed the room's entire energy. Elena Vaughn stepped off the private elevator at exactly 7 a.m. Daniel had seen photos, of course. Professional headshots on the company website, the occasional business publication profile. But photographs hadn't prepared him for the reality of her presence. She was tall, maybe 5'10", in the modest heels she wore, with dark hair pulled back in a style that was simultaneously severe and elegant. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than 3 months of Daniel's salary, and she moved through the office with the kind of purposeful efficiency that suggested every step had been calculated for maximum effectiveness. But it was her eyes that stopped Daniel cold. Even from across the office, he could see them, dark, intense, and currently scanning the room with the focus of someone cataloging every detail, every person, every potential weakness. Her gaze swept past him once, then returned. For exactly 3 seconds, Elena Vaughn looked directly at Daniel Hayes. It wasn't a welcoming look. It wasn't hostile either. It was assessing, analytical, the kind of look that made Daniel feel like he was being taken apart and reassembled in real time, every flaw and strength cataloged with mechanical precision. Then she was gone, disappearing into her corner office without a word. "Welcome to Vaughn Meridian," James murmured. "Try not to let her get in your head." But it was already too late for that. The first assignment landed on Daniel's desk at 9:47 a.m., delivered via email with a subject line that read simply, "Market Analysis, due Friday." The attachment was a 40-page document outlining a potential acquisition target, a mid-sized logistics company based in Indianapolis. Daniel's task was straightforward: analyze their market position, identify strategic vulnerabilities, and provide recommendations for either acquisition or partnership. He had 4 days. Daniel dove in with the kind of focused intensity that had gotten him through every difficult period of his life. He stayed until 7:30 that first night, until the cleaning crew arrived and gently suggested he go home. He caught the bus back to Bridgeport, picked up Maya from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment downstairs, heated up leftover pasta, helped with homework, read 3 chapters of the Chronicles of Narnia, and waited until his daughter was asleep before pulling out his laptop and working until midnight. The pattern repeated itself Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. By Friday morning, Daniel had produced a 23-page analysis that he'd reviewed and revised 17 times. It wasn't perfect, he knew that, but it was thorough, detailed, and backed by data he'd spent hours compiling from public records, industry reports, and competitor analysis. He submitted it at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the deadline, and allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of satisfaction before moving on to the next assignment. The feedback arrived at 2:17 p.m. Daniel was in the middle of a conference call when his laptop pinged with a new email notification. The sender, Elena Vaughn. The subject, Market Analysis. His heart rate accelerated as he opened the attachment. The document he'd submitted was now covered in red annotations. Not just a few comments scattered throughout, but dense, detailed notes on nearly every page. Entire paragraphs had been highlighted with questions that started with phrases like, insufficient evidence for this conclusion, and have you considered, and this analysis overlooks. Daniel's carefully constructed confidence began to crumble. On page 7, next to his assessment of market positioning, too surface level. Where's the competitive differentiation analysis? On page 12, beside his financial projections, these numbers assume static market conditions. Demonstrate scenario modeling. On page 18, you're describing what is. I need to understand what could be. There were 47 separate comments in total. Daniel read through them twice, his initial defensiveness giving way to something more complicated. Because the thing was, Elena Vaughn was right. About all of it. Every criticism exposed a gap in his analysis, a question he hadn't asked, an assumption he'd made without adequate support. She hadn't just read his work, she'd dissected it. James noticed him staring at his screen. First feedback from Elena? Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Yeah, James said sympathetically. She has that effect. How bad is it? 47 comments. James whistled low. Actually, that's a lot of attention for a first assignment. Most of us get 3, maybe 4 comments if we're lucky. She must think you can handle it. Or she's building a case to fire me, Daniel said quietly. Nah, James said. If Elena wanted you gone, you'd already be gone. This is different. This is her pushing you. The question was, toward what? Intent. That night, after Maya was asleep, Daniel sat at their tiny kitchen table and went through every single comment with surgical precision. He pulled additional data. He ran new models. He questioned his own assumptions and rebuilt his analysis from the foundation up. At 2:30 a.m., bleary-eyed and running on his 3rd cup of coffee, he submitted a revised version with a brief note. Thank you for the feedback. Please see attached revision addressing your concerns. He woke up 5 hours later to a new email. Better. Still missing strategic depth on competitive response scenarios. See attached notes. EV19. New comments. Daniel almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he got Maya ready for school, dropped her off, and spent his entire commute planning his next revision. The pattern established itself over the following 3 weeks. Every assignment Daniel completed came back with detailed surgical feedback from Elena Vaughn herself, while his colleagues received occasional notes from senior analysts or project managers. Daniel's work went directly to the CEO, who proceeded to take it apart with the precision of a master craftsman identifying flaws in a student's work. In meetings, it was worse. The first time Daniel presented in a team strategy session, Elena sat in the back of the conference room, silent and still as a statue. He'd made it exactly 11 minutes into his presentation before she'd raised one hand slightly. Stop, she said quietly. The room went silent. Slide 6, Elena continued, her voice calm and absolutely devastating. You've identified the problem. You've outlined the industry context. But you haven't told me why this problem exists in the first place. You're treating symptoms, Mr. Hayes. I need you to identify the disease. Daniel's carefully prepared remarks evaporated from his mind. The data suggests correlation, Elena interrupted. I'm asking about causation. Why is this happening? What structural factors created this vulnerability? And more importantly, what does that tell us about how to solve it? She wasn't being cruel. Her tone remained neutral, almost clinical. But the effect was absolute dismantlement. Daniel tried to recover. If we look at the market dynamics, you're still describing, Elena said. I need you to analyze. These are different cognitive functions, Mr. Hayes. One is observation, the other is understanding. The meeting continued, but Daniel barely registered it. He felt exposed. Inadequate, like a student who'd shown up to an advanced physics exam with a basic algebra understanding. Afterward, James found him in the break room, staring into a cup of coffee. "She eviscerated you in there," James said, not unkindly. "I know." "You know what's weird, though?" James leaned against the counter. "She doesn't usually bother with that level of detailed criticism. Most people she just ignores or replaces. The fact that she's taking the time to explain where you're falling short, that's actually significant." "Feels more like torture," Daniel muttered. "Yeah," James agreed. "But it's interesting torture. Trust me, you'd rather have her attention than her indifference." Daniel wasn't sure he agreed. The breaking point came during week 4. Daniel had just completed a competitive analysis for a potential client in the pharmaceutical sector. He'd worked on it for 6 days straight, sacrificing sleep, time with Maya, and what little remained of his sanity. The final report was 38 pages of meticulously researched analysis, backed by data from 17 different sources. He submitted it with quiet confidence. It came back 2 hours later with a single comment. "This is derivative thinking. You're telling me what everyone already knows. I need you to find what nobody else is seeing. Resubmit. EV." Daniel stared at the screen, feeling something crack inside his chest. He'd been working 70-hour weeks. He'd been pushing himself harder than he'd ever pushed, learning faster than he thought possible, absorbing criticism that would have destroyed most people's confidence. And it still wasn't enough. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out of the office without a word. The Chicago wind cut through his inadequate coat as Daniel stood on the riverside walkway, staring at the murky water below. It wasn't despair exactly. It was exhaustion combined with the crushing realization that maybe he'd been right all along. Maybe he didn't belong here. Maybe no amount of effort could bridge the gap between where he'd started and where Elena Vaughn expected him to be. "Mr. Hayes?" Daniel turned to find Margaret Chen standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "Taking a mental health break?" she asked, moving to stand beside him at the railing. "Something like that," Daniel said. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then, "Elena can be challenging. That's one word for it. She's also brilliant, demanding, and constitutionally incapable of accepting anything less than exceptional work," Margaret continued, "which makes her either the best boss you'll ever have or the worst, depending on how you handle pressure." "I'm handling it," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Are you?" Margaret asked gently. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who's about to walk away." Daniel didn't respond. "Can I tell you something about Elena?" Margaret asked. "When she started this company, she was 22 years old. Everyone told her she was too young, too inexperienced, too female to succeed in this industry. She proved them wrong by being smarter, working harder, and refusing to accept mediocrity, especially from herself. What does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Margaret said, "because Elena doesn't waste time on people she's written off. If she thought you couldn't handle the work, you'd know. This?" She gestured toward the building. "This is her investing in you, in her own particularly brutal way." "It doesn't feel like investment," Daniel said quietly. "It feels like she's trying to prove I'm not good enough." "Or," Margaret countered, "she's trying to prove that you are, even when you don't believe it yourself." Daniel returned to his desk at 3:47 p.m., pulled up the rejected report, and started over from scratch. This time he didn't just compile data. He questioned it. He looked for patterns nobody else had identified. He spent hours reading industry journals, following tangential research threads, building connections that weren't obvious. At 11:30 p.m., sitting at his kitchen table while Maya slept in the next room, Daniel found it. A small inconsistency in the pharmaceutical company's patent filings, combined with unusual hiring patterns in their R&D division and a series of seemingly unrelated regulatory submissions. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they suggested the company was preparing to pivot into a completely different market segment, one that would make them either incredibly valuable or completely irrelevant depending on pending FDA decisions. It was speculative. It was risky. It required him to make inferential leaps that weren't entirely supported by hard data. But it was exactly the kind of insight Elena Vaughn had been demanding. He submitted the revised report at 1:43 a.m. with a note. "Found something everyone else is missing. Could be wrong. But if I'm right, it changes everything. He fell asleep at his kitchen table and woke up 3 hours later to his phone buzzing with a new email. Conference Room B, 8 a.m. Bring your analysis. E.V. But Conference Room B was on the executive floor, a space Daniel had never entered before. Glass walls, minimalist furniture, and a view of the city that made his stomach drop. Elena Vaughn was already there when he arrived at 7:58 a.m., standing by the window with a tablet in her hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said without turning around, "talk me through your revised analysis." Daniel set his laptop on the conference table, his hands steadier than he expected. The original request was to assess market position and competitive vulnerabilities. But I think that's the wrong question. Elena turned to face him, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Go on?" "Everyone in the industry is evaluating this company based on their current product line," Daniel continued, pulling up his presentation. "But if you look at their patent activity over the past 18 months, combined with their hiring patterns and regulatory submissions, they're not reinforcing their current position. They're building capacity for something entirely different." He walked her through it methodically. The evidence, the connections, the implications. Elena listened without interruption, her expression impossible to read. When he finished, silence filled the room for what felt like an eternity. Then Elena moved to the conference table, set down her tablet, and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd entered the room. "This is speculative," she said. "Yes. You're making inferential leaps that could be completely wrong." "I know. If you present this analysis to a client and you're incorrect, it could cost us the account and damage our reputation." "I understand." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "But if you're right, it means everyone else in the industry is looking at the wrong metrics and asking the wrong questions." "Yes," Daniel said quietly. For the first time since he'd met her, Elena Vaughn smiled. It was small, brief, and absolutely transformative. "This is the work I've been waiting for," she said. "This is thinking, Mr. Hayes, not just analysis, but genuine strategic insight." She paused. "It needs refinement. You'll need to build stronger supporting evidence. But the core observation is exactly what I hired you to find." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, relief, validation, and something close to pride. "I'm going to assign you to the Meridian Project," Elena continued, her tone returning to its usual business-like efficiency. "It's our highest profile client engagement this quarter. You'll be working directly with senior partners, which means your work will be under constant scrutiny. Are you ready for that?" Daniel thought about Maya, about the apartment in Bridgeport, about every reason he couldn't afford to fail. "Yes," he said. "Good." Elena picked up her tablet and moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Mr. Hayes." "Yes?" She turned back, and for a moment, Daniel saw something in her expression he couldn't quite identify. "The work you're doing, it's good, but you're holding back. I can see it in your analysis, in your presentations. You're second-guessing yourself before you even begin." The observation was so accurate it felt invasive. "I want you to stop doing that," Elena said quietly. "You're smarter than you think you are. Trust that." Before Daniel could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone in the conference room with a racing heart and the unsettling feeling that Elena Vaughn saw far more than he'd ever intended to reveal. The Meridian Project consumed the next 2 weeks of Daniel's life. He worked alongside senior partners who had decades of experience, contributed to strategy sessions that shaped million-dollar decisions, and somehow, impossibly, held his own. The work was brutal, the hours were crushing, but for the first time since starting at Vaughn Meridian, Daniel felt like he belonged. Elena's feedback continued, but it had changed. The comments were still detailed, still demanding, but they were collaborative now, pushing him toward better thinking rather than just identifying flaws. "Have you considered this angle?" Strong analysis. "Now take it further. This is good. I need you to make it exceptional." In meetings, she began directing questions to him specifically, watching his responses with that same intense focus that had terrified him during his first week. But Daniel was starting to understand what James had meant about her attention being significant. Elena Vaughn didn't waste time on people she'd written off, and she was spending a lot of time on Daniel Hayes. It was Margaret who first noticed the pattern. She watches you, Margaret said one afternoon, catching Daniel off guard in the break room. What? Elena, Margaret clarified, stirring her coffee slowly. In meetings. She watches how you think, how you respond to challenges. I've worked with her for 6 years, and I've never seen her pay this much attention to a junior analyst. Daniel felt his face heat. She's just making sure I don't screw up the Meridian project. Maybe, Margaret said, her tone suggesting she didn't believe that for a second. Or maybe she's found something she wasn't expecting. Before Daniel could ask what that meant, his phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Meridian Project Final Presentation, tomorrow, 2 p.m. Client attendance confirmed. EV tomorrow. The presentation that would determine whether Daniel's insights had actual value or if he'd been building castles on sand. He spent that entire night preparing, running through scenarios, anticipating questions, refining every slide until it was perfect. At 6:30 a.m., he received an email from Elena. You're ready. Trust yourself. EV. 4 words that somehow meant everything. The presentation took place in the main conference room on the 68th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago that Daniel barely noticed. The client, a Fortune 500 manufacturing company considering a major strategic pivot, sat on one side of the table. Vaughn Meridian's senior team, including Elena, sat on the other. Daniel stood at the head of the table, laptop connected to the main display, and tried to remember how to breathe. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. Over the past 2 weeks, we've conducted a comprehensive analysis of your market position and growth opportunities. What we found challenges some fundamental assumptions about where your company should be heading. He walked them through it methodically, the data, the trends, the strategic implications. He anticipated objections before they were raised, addressed concerns with additional evidence, and built a narrative that transformed complex analysis into clear, actionable recommendations. Halfway through, he caught Elena's eye. She was watching him with that same intense focus, but something in her expression had shifted. There was no criticism there, no assessment of flaws. There was something else entirely, something that looked almost like pride. Daniel felt a surge of confidence and pushed forward, taking risks with his conclusions that he wouldn't have dared attempt 4 weeks ago. When he finished, the room was silent. Then the client's CEO, a man named Richard Morrison, who'd built his company over 30 years, leaned back in his chair and said, "That's the most innovative strategic analysis we've received in a decade." The next 15 minutes were a flurry of questions, clarifications, and discussion. Daniel handled all of it, supported by the senior partners but leading the conversation himself. When the meeting finally concluded, Morrison shook Daniel's hand personally. "I don't know where Elena found you, but she's got good instincts." After the clients left, the Vaughn Meridian team gathered for a brief debrief. Elena said very little, just watched as the senior partners congratulated Daniel on the successful presentation. Then, as everyone began filing out, Elena's voice cut through the conversation. "Mr. Hayes, a moment." The room emptied quickly, leaving just the two of them. Elena stood by the window, her back to him, looking out at the city below. "That was exceptional work," she said quietly. "Thank you." "You've grown significantly in the past month," Elena continued, still not turning around. "When you started, you were competent but cautious, skilled but uncertain. Now you're starting to trust your own judgment. That's the difference between a good analyst and a great one." Daniel didn't know what to say. "I'm promoting you to senior analyst," Elena said, finally turning to face him. "Effective immediately, it's earlier than standard protocol, but your work has earned it." "I don't know what to say," Daniel managed. "Thank you is traditional," Elena said, and there was the faintest hint of amusement in her voice. "Thank you," Daniel said, "for everything, for pushing me, for the feedback, for believing I could do this even when I didn't." Something flickered across Elena's face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "I saw something in you from the beginning," she said quietly. "Not just intelligence or work ethic. Those are common enough. I saw someone who understood what it meant to fight for something that mattered. Someone who didn't take this opportunity for granted because he knew exactly what it cost to get here." Daniel's breath caught. How much did she know? "I believe in earned success, Mr. Hayes," Elena continued. "Not privilege, not connections, not the accidents of birth. Results, growth. The willingness to be challenged and come back stronger. She paused. You've demonstrated all of that. I won't let you down, Daniel said. I know, Elena replied. Then, more quietly, that's not what concerns me. Before Daniel could ask what she meant, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her professional mask slid back into place. We have a partners meeting in 10 minutes, she said. I'll have HR process your promotion paperwork. Congratulations, Mr. Hayes. She left the conference room with her usual efficient stride, leaving Daniel alone with a promotion he'd never expected, and the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted between them, something neither of them had anticipated, and something that would complicate everything. That night, Daniel picked up Maya from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment and took her to their favorite diner in Bridgeport, a tiny place called Rosie's that served breakfast all day and had vinyl booths patched with duct tape. You're smiling, Maya observed, dunking a French fry in ketchup. Like, a lot. I got promoted today, Daniel said. Maya's eyes went wide. Does that mean we can get a bigger apartment? Maybe, Daniel said carefully. Eventually. We're still going to be careful with money, okay? But things are getting better. I knew you could do it, Maya said with the absolute confidence only a 7-year-old could muster. You're the smartest person I know. Daniel's throat tightened. Thanks, kiddo. Is your boss still mean to you? Daniel thought about Elena's words in the conference room. I saw something in you from the beginning. She's not mean, he said slowly. She's just demanding. She wants people to be their best. That's good, Maya said pragmatically. Otherwise you'd just be lazy. Daniel laughed, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. But later that night, after Maya was asleep and he sat alone with his laptop, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of Elena's expression during his presentation, the way she'd watched him, the quiet pride in her voice. That's not what concerns me. What had she meant by that? Daniel pulled up his email, intending to review tomorrow's schedule, and found a message sent 40 minutes ago. From Elena Vaughn. Subject: Company Retreat. All senior staff are required to attend the annual strategic planning retreat next weekend. Location details attached. Your attendance is mandatory. E.V. Daniel opened the attachment and felt his stomach drop. The retreat was being held at a luxury lodge in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. 2 full days of strategic planning sessions, team-building activities, and, according to the schedule, a dinner on Saturday night where attendance was business formal required, which meant Daniel needed a suit he didn't own, travel arrangements for Maya he couldn't afford, and 2 days away from his daughter that would cost more in childcare than he wanted to calculate. But the email had been clear. Attendance was mandatory. Daniel closed his laptop and stared at the ceiling of his tiny apartment, trying to calculate costs and logistics, and wondering, not for the first time, if success in Elena Vaughn's world required sacrifices he wasn't prepared to make. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Don't overthink the retreat. Just show up. You belong there. Evie. Daniel stared at the message, his heart hammering. How had she gotten his personal number? More importantly, how had she known exactly what he was thinking? He typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on, "Thank you. I'll be there." The reply came 30 seconds later. "Good. Sleep well, Mr. Hayes." Daniel set down his phone and tried not to think about the fact that Elena Vaughn, billionaire CEO, his boss, the most intimidating person he'd ever met, had just told him to sleep well. Tried not to think about the warmth that simple message had created in his chest. Tried not to acknowledge that somewhere between brutal criticism and professional mentorship, something else had started growing. Something complicated. Something dangerous. Something that terrified him far more than any presentation or performance review ever could. Because Daniel Hayes had walked into Elena Vaughn's world prepared to prove himself professionally. He hadn't been prepared for the possibility that she might be seeing him as something more than just another analyst. And he definitely hadn't been prepared for the realization that he was starting to see her the same way. Outside his window, Chicago hummed with late-night traffic, indifferent to the quiet transformation taking place in a studio apartment in Bridgeport, where a single father with a forged degree and everything to lose was beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing in Elena Vaughn's world wasn't the work. It was the woman herself. The week leading up to the Lake Geneva retreat passed in a blur of logistical nightmares and professional victories that Daniel couldn't quite reconcile. His promotion had come with a salary increase that would change everything for him and Maya, but it wouldn't hit his account until the following month, which meant he was still operating on a warehouse worker's budget while trying to navigate a world that assumed he had money to spare. The suit problem solved itself in an unexpected way. On Tuesday afternoon, Daniel found a garment bag hanging on his desk chair with a note attached in handwriting he didn't recognize. Consider this an early promotion gift, non-negotiable. MC. Inside was a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, along with a white dress shirt and a silk tie in deep blue. Margaret Chen, apparently, had decided to intervene before Daniel showed up to a business formal event in the only sport coat he owned, the one with the slightly frayed cuffs that he'd bought at a Goodwill in Rogers Park. The childcare situation proved more complicated. Mrs. Rodriguez agreed to watch Maya for the weekend, but Daniel could see the concern in her eyes when he explained he'd be 2 hours away in Wisconsin. His daughter had never spent a full weekend without him, and the guilt sat heavy in his chest as he packed his overnight bag Thursday night. "You're doing that thing again," Maya said from her position on the couch, where she was supposedly doing homework but was actually watching him with the unsettling perceptiveness of a child who'd learned to read her parents' moods too early. "What thing?" Daniel asked, folding the new shirt carefully. "The thing where you feel bad about stuff that isn't bad," Maya said. "Mrs. Rodriguez makes good pancakes. I'll be fine." "I know you will," Daniel said, sitting down beside her. "But I'm still going to miss you." "It's only 2 days," Maya said pragmatically. "And you said this job is important." "It is." "Then go do important stuff," she said, returning her attention to her math worksheet. "Just bring me back one of those fancy hotel soaps." Daniel pulled her into a hug, marveling at how she could make everything seem simple, when his own mind was tangled with complications he couldn't begin to explain. That night, he received another text from Elena's number. "Transportation has been arranged. Car will pick you up Friday at 7 a.m. Don't argue." Daniel stared at the message, torn between gratitude and discomfort. He'd been planning to take the metro to Union Station and then figure out a bus route to Lake Geneva, which would have taken 4 hours and cost him most of a day. But accepting this kind of help felt dangerous, like acknowledging that he couldn't manage the basics of this new life on his own. He typed back, "That's not necessary. I can arrange my own transportation." The response came immediately. "You could, but you'd spend 6 hours on public transit when that time could be better spent preparing for your presentation. This is efficiency, not charity. 7 a.m. Don't be late." Daniel read the message 3 times, trying to decode the tone. Was she being helpful, controlling, something else entirely? Finally, he replied, "Thank you. I'll be ready." Her response was just a period, a single punctuation mark that somehow conveyed approval, finality, and the end of discussion all at once. Daniel set down his phone and tried not to think about the fact that he and Elena Vaughn were now texting each other at 10:30 p.m. about logistics that could have been handled through official channels. Tried not to acknowledge that every interaction with her felt increasingly personal, even when the content was purely professional. The car that arrived Friday morning was a black Mercedes sedan with a driver named Marcus, who treated Daniel with the same professional courtesy he presumably showed to actual executives. The interior smelled like leather and success, and Daniel felt profoundly out of place as they merged onto I-94 heading north. He spent the drive reviewing his notes for the presentation he'd be giving Saturday afternoon, a strategic analysis of emerging market opportunities that would set the direction for several major client engagements. It was high-stakes work, the kind of thing that senior partners usually handled, and Daniel was determined to prove that Elena's faith in his promotion hadn't been misplaced. The lodge emerged from the Wisconsin forest like something out of a luxury travel magazine, all timber and stone and windows that reflected the late morning sun off Lake Geneva's crystalline surface. Daniel counted at least 40 rooms visible from the circular driveway, along with what appeared to be a separate conference center and a boathouse that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. "Mr. Hayes." Margaret Chen appeared at the entrance as Daniel climbed out of the Mercedes, looking relaxed in casual slacks and a cashmere sweater that Daniel suspected cost more than his monthly rent. "Glad you made it. Your room is on the second floor east wing. We're gathering for lunch in 30 minutes, then breaking into strategy sessions this afternoon." "Thank you for the suit," Daniel said quietly as they walked through the lobby. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Elena mentioned you might need one. Consider it a welcome to senior staff gift. Elena asked you to... Elena notices everything, Margaret interrupted gently. It's both her greatest strength and most exhausting quality. She saw you were uncomfortable about the dress code and solved the problem. Don't read too much into it. But Daniel couldn't help reading into it, just like he couldn't help noticing that his room, which Margaret had described as standard accommodation, had a king-size bed, a gas fireplace, and a balcony overlooking the lake. This wasn't standard. This was the kind of room reserved for senior partners and VIP clients. He texted Elena before he could stop himself. Thank you for the transportation, and apparently the room upgrade. The response came 10 minutes later. You're presenting tomorrow. You need to be rested and focused. This is strategic resource allocation. Daniel smiled despite himself and replied, Is that what we're calling it? 3 dots appeared, indicating she was typing. Then they disappeared. Then reappeared. Finally, I call it what it is, Mr. Hayes. I suggest you do the same. Daniel stared at the message, trying to parse the meaning beneath the words. Was that a warning? An invitation? A reminder to maintain professional boundaries? Before he could formulate a response, his phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Lunch. Main dining hall. 15 minutes. The dining hall was all exposed timber beams and floor-to-ceiling windows, with round tables set for groups of 6. Daniel found himself seated between James Park and a senior partner named David Cho, with Margaret directly across from him. Elena sat at a table on the opposite side of the room with the firm's founding partners, her attention focused on whatever Richard Torres was explaining with animated hand gestures. But twice during the meal, Daniel caught her looking in his direction. Brief glances that could have meant nothing. Probably meant nothing. So, James said, keeping his voice low, you got the East Wing room. Is that significant? Daniel asked. That's where senior leadership stays, James said. Junior analysts like me are in the West Wing, which is nice but decidedly less luxurious. Someone thinks you're more important than your title suggests. David Cho, who'd been quietly eating his salmon, looked up with amusement. Someone thinks he needs to be sharp for tomorrow's presentation. Elena's not sentimental about accommodations. She's strategic. If Hayes is getting the good room, it's because she needs him performing at his peak. Right, James said, but his tone suggested he didn't entirely buy that explanation. The afternoon strategy sessions were exactly as advertised. Intense, focused discussions about the firm's direction over the next fiscal year. Daniel participated where appropriate, offered insights when asked, and tried to ignore the growing awareness that he was operating at a level he'd barely imagined 6 weeks ago. During a break between sessions, he found himself alone on one of the lodge's exterior decks, watching the late afternoon sun paint the lake in shades of amber and gold. The November air was sharp, but Daniel welcomed the cold. It helped clear his head. You're avoiding the social component. Elena's voice came from behind him, and Daniel turned to find her standing in the doorway, still in her business attire from the afternoon sessions. A charcoal dress that was professional and elegant, and made Daniel very aware that he should not be noticing such things. Just needed some air, Daniel said. Elena stepped onto the deck, moving to stand beside him at the railing. She didn't look at him, just gazed out at the water. You did well in the sessions today. Your analysis of the healthcare sector opportunities was particularly strong. Thank you. You're still second-guessing yourself, though, Elena continued. I can see it in how you present ideas. You offer them tentatively, like you're waiting for someone to tell you you're wrong. Daniel didn't respond immediately, because she was right, and they both knew it. Want to know what I see when I look at your work? Elena asked, finally turning to face him. Daniel met her gaze, struck again by the intensity of her focus. What do you see? Someone who's been told he's not good enough so many times that he's internalized it as fact, Elena said quietly. Someone who's fighting against his own potential because he can't quite believe it's real. The observation hit too close to home. Is this the part where you give me a motivational speech about believing in myself? No, Elena said. This is the part where I tell you that your self-doubt is becoming a liability. Not to me. I know what you're capable of. But to yourself. You're limiting your own growth because you're too busy trying to prove you deserve to be here instead of just doing the work. Easy for you to say, Daniel said before he could stop himself. You've never had to prove you belong. Elena's expression shifted, not anger, but something colder. You don't know anything about what I've had to prove, Mr. Hayes. The use of his formal name felt like a door closing, and Daniel immediately regretted his words. I'm sorry, that was out of line. Yes, it was, Elena agreed, but her tone had softened slightly. Though I suppose I should expect defensive reactions when I push this hard. She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. I'm not your enemy, Daniel. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and the intimacy of it struck him like a physical force. I know, he said quietly. Do you? Elena asked. Because sometimes I think you're treating this like a battle you're trying to survive instead of an opportunity you've earned. Maybe that's because I'm not sure I did earn it, Daniel admitted. The confession emerged before he could think better of it, raw and honest in a way that terrified him. Elena studied him for a long moment. Why did you apply to Vaughn Meridian? I needed a job that could support my daughter. That's not what I asked, Elena said. Why this firm specifically? Why not a dozen other companies where the standards would have been lower and the pressure less intense? Daniel thought about the truth, about seeing the Vaughn Meridian building from the bus and feeling something shift inside him, about reading Elena's profile in Business Insider and recognizing something in her story that resonated with his own journey, about wanting to prove that people from places like Bridgeport could succeed in places like this. Because I wanted to know if I could do it, he said finally. If I was actually good enough, or if I'd just been telling myself comfortable lies. And what have you learned? Elena asked. That I'm somewhere in between, Daniel said. Good enough to survive here. Maybe not good enough to actually succeed. You're wrong, Elena said with such certainty that Daniel almost believed her. You're not somewhere in between, you're at the beginning. And the fact that you can't see that yet is exactly why I push you the way I do. Why do you care? The question emerged quietly, but it carried weight. You have dozens of analysts. Why invest this much attention in one junior employee? Elena was silent for a long moment, and Daniel watched something complicated move across her expression. Calculation, consideration, and something that might have been vulnerability. Because I see something in you that reminds me of myself, she said finally. Before I learned to trust my own judgment, before I stopped apologizing for being good at what I do. She paused. And because I think you're capable of exceptional work if you can get out of your own way. That's it? Daniel asked. Professional development? Elena's gaze sharpened. What else would it be? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither seemed willing to address directly. Nothing, Daniel said, even though they both knew it was a lie. Professional development makes sense. Good, Elena said, her tone returning to its usual business-like efficiency. Then we understand each other. I expect exceptional work from you tomorrow. Don't let your self-doubt undermine your preparation. She turned to leave, and Daniel should have let her go. Should have maintained the professional distance that was clearly the smart choice. Instead, he said, Elena. Well, she stopped, turned back. The use of her first name clearly surprised her, but she didn't correct him. Thank you, Daniel said. For pushing me, for seeing something I couldn't see in myself, for... He gestured vaguely at the lodge, the room, everything. For all of it. Something softened in Elena's expression. You're welcome, Daniel. Now go get some rest. Tomorrow matters. She left him alone on the deck as the sun finished setting over Lake Geneva, and Daniel stood there for another 15 minutes, trying to process the conversation and failing completely. Because Elena Vaughn had just admitted she saw something of herself in him, had used his first name, had looked at him with an intensity that transcended any reasonable professional interest. And Daniel was beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing about working for Elena Vaughn wasn't the demanding standards or brutal feedback. It was the growing certainty that the lines between professional mentorship and something far more complicated were starting to blur in ways that neither of them seemed able to control. Dinner that evening was a formal affair in the lodge's main banquet hall, with assigned seating that placed Daniel at a table with senior partners he barely knew. Elena sat 3 tables away, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion with the firm's CFO, and Daniel tried not to notice how often his gaze drifted in her direction. You should be careful, Margaret Chen said quietly, appearing beside him during the cocktail reception that preceded dinner. Careful of what? Daniel asked, though he suspected he knew. Elena is brilliant, driven, and absolutely committed to this firm's success, Margaret said. She's also human, even if she works very hard to pretend otherwise. And humans make mistakes when professional boundaries start feeling negotiable. I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel said. Yes, you do, Margaret replied gently. I've worked with Elena for 6 years. I've never seen her take this kind of personal interest in an employee's development. Never seen her spend this much time on someone's growth. And I've definitely never seen her look at someone the way she looks at you. Daniel's heart hammered. She's my boss, that's all. For both your sakes, I hope you're right, Margaret said. But if I'm not, be very careful, Daniel. Elena has built everything she has on reputation, credibility, and unimpeachable professional standards. If that gets compromised by perception or reality, it could destroy her. And you too. Before Daniel could respond, the dinner bell chimed and people began moving toward their assigned tables. Daniel spent the meal engaged in surface-level conversation about market trends and client strategies, contributing where appropriate while his mind churned with Margaret's warning. Across the room, Elena laughed at something Richard Torres said, and Daniel felt an irrational spike of something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. This was dangerous. All of it. The promotion, the attention, the private conversations on exterior decks. It was all creating exactly the kind of complication that could unravel everything he'd worked for. After dinner, most of the senior staff migrated to the lodge's library for drinks and informal networking. Daniel excused himself early, claiming he needed to review his presentation materials, and retreated to his room on the east wing. He did actually review his notes, but his concentration was fractured. Every few minutes, his mind would drift back to Elena's words on the deck. I see something in you that reminds me of myself. At 10:47 p.m., someone knocked on his door. Daniel opened it to find Elena standing in the hallway, still in her dinner attire but with her hair down now, falling past her shoulders in a way that made her look simultaneously more approachable and more dangerous. We need to talk, she said. Daniel stepped back, allowing her to enter, and tried to ignore the voice in his head screaming that this was a terrible idea. Elena moved to the window, looking out at the lake barely visible in the darkness. Margaret spoke to you. How did you... Because she spoke to me first, Elena said, turning to face him. Warned me that I was being too attentive, that people were starting to notice, that I was compromising my own professional standards. Was she wrong? Daniel asked quietly. Elena was silent for a long moment. No, she said finally. She wasn't wrong. I have been paying you more attention than professional development requires. I have been spending more time thinking about your growth than makes strategic sense. And I have been telling myself it's purely professional when we both know that's becoming less true every day. Daniel's breath caught. Elena, let me finish, she said, and there was something almost vulnerable in her voice that Daniel had never heard before. When you walked into that break room 6 weeks ago, I saw someone who didn't belong in my world. Someone who was trying too hard, who'd probably lied on his application, who was clearly in over his head. Daniel felt his face heat with shame. She'd known. From the beginning, she'd known. I should have dismissed you immediately, Elena continued. Should have had HR investigate your credentials and shown you the door. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way you looked at your daughter's picture when you thought no one was watching. Maybe it was seeing someone fight for an opportunity the way I had to fight when I was starting out. Or maybe... She paused, meeting his gaze directly. Maybe it was something I didn't want to acknowledge then and shouldn't acknowledge now. What are you saying? Daniel asked, even though he knew, even though the truth was written in every tense line of her posture. I'm saying that Margaret is right to be concerned, Elena said. I'm saying that this, whatever this is becoming, is complicated and potentially destructive and exactly the kind of thing I've spent my entire career avoiding. Then why are you here? Daniel asked. Why did you come to my room at 11 p.m. to tell me this? Elena's composure cracked slightly. Because I needed you to know that I'm aware of what's happening, that I'm not oblivious to the lines we're approaching, and that tomorrow, after your presentation, we need to reestablish proper professional boundaries before this situation becomes something neither of us can control. What if I don't want to reestablish boundaries? The words emerged before Daniel could stop them, dangerous and honest. Elena's expression shifted, surprise, conflict, and something that looked like longing. Then you're not thinking clearly about what that would mean for both of us. Maybe I am thinking clearly, Daniel said, taking a step closer. Maybe I'm just done pretending I don't notice the way you look at me, the way you've invested in my success, the way every interaction between us feels like something more than professional development. Daniel, Elena's voice carried a warning, but she didn't step back. You said you see something in me that reminds you of yourself, Daniel continued. What if what you actually see is someone who understands what it means to fight for everything you have? Someone who doesn't take any of this for granted because he knows exactly what it costs to get here? What if that's not just professional recognition? This is a terrible idea, Elena said, but her certainty was wavering. Probably, Daniel agreed, but that doesn't make it less true. They stood there, 18 inches apart in a luxury hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, and Daniel watched Elena wrestle with something that clearly went against every instinct she'd honed over a decade of ruthless professional discipline. Finally, she stepped back, and the moment broke. Tomorrow, she said, her voice returning to its controlled neutrality. You're going to deliver an exceptional presentation. You're going to prove to everyone in that room that my faith in you was justified, and then we're going to have a very serious conversation about appropriate professional boundaries. And if I don't want to have that conversation, Daniel asked. Then I'll have it for both of us, Elena said, moving toward the door. Because one of us needs to be thinking clearly about the consequences. She paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him with an expression that was equal parts regret and resolve. Get some sleep, Daniel. Tomorrow matters more than you realize. Then she was gone, leaving Daniel alone in a room that suddenly felt too large and too empty. He didn't sleep. Instead, he stood at the window watching darkness give way to dawn, thinking about everything Elena had admitted and everything she hadn't, about the lie on his application that she'd apparently known about from the beginning, about professional boundaries and the increasingly undeniable reality that what existed between them had moved far beyond simple mentorship. When morning finally arrived, Daniel showered, dressed in the suit Margaret had gifted him, and spent 2 hours reviewing his presentation until every word, every slide, every potential question had been rehearsed to perfection. At 1:45 p.m., he walked into the lodge's main conference center and found the entire senior staff assembled, 43 of Von Meridian's best and brightest, all waiting to evaluate whether Elena Von's controversial promotion of a junior analyst had been justified or a rare lapse in judgment. Elena sat in the front row, her expression professionally neutral, giving no indication that she'd been in his room the night before confessing things that should never have been said. Daniel connected his laptop to the projection system, pulled up his first slide, and took a breath. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Over the past month, our team has been analyzing emerging opportunities in the renewable energy sector. What we've found suggests that the entire industry is approaching a critical inflection point that will fundamentally reshape market dynamics over the next 18 months. He walked them through it systematically, the data, the trends, the strategic implications that most competitors were missing. He anticipated objections, addressed concerns, built a narrative that transformed complex market analysis into clear, actionable intelligence. And throughout the entire presentation, he felt Elena's gaze on him, not assessing anymore, not cataloging weaknesses or identifying flaws, watching him with something that looked almost like pride. When he finished 45 minutes later, the room erupted in questions. Daniel fielded them all, supported by senior partners but leading the discussion himself, demonstrating not just knowledge, but genuine strategic insight. Finally, Richard Torres, the most senior partner in the firm, stood up and said, "That's the kind of forward-thinking analysis that built this company. Well done, Hayes." The applause that followed was genuine, warm, and Daniel felt something shift in how the room perceived him. He was no longer the questionable junior analyst who'd somehow gotten promoted too fast. He was someone who belonged. As people filtered out for the afternoon break, Elena approached him directly for the first time all day. "Exceptional work," she said, her tone professional, but her eyes carrying messages that had nothing to do with business. "You've proven exactly what I knew you could." "Thank you," Daniel said. We should talk, Elena continued, after the closing session tonight, about your trajectory here, about next steps, about boundaries, Daniel thought, about the conversation she'd promised they'd have. I'll find you, he said. Elena nodded and turned to leave, but before she did, she said quietly, so quietly that only Daniel could hear, You made me proud today. I wanted you to know that. Then she was gone, leaving Daniel surrounded by congratulating colleagues and trying to process the fact that Elena Vaughn had just told him she was proud of him in a tone that suggested she meant far more than professional satisfaction. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of positive feedback and networking conversations. But Daniel's mind was elsewhere, already anticipating the conversation that would happen tonight. The one where they'd either re-establish professional boundaries or acknowledge that something fundamental had shifted between them. Something that couldn't be undone with corporate policies or careful distance. Something that had started with brutal criticism and impossible standards but had evolved into recognition, respect, and the dangerous possibility of something neither of them had planned for. As the sun set over Lake Geneva for the second time that weekend, Daniel understood with perfect clarity that his life was about to change again. The only question was whether he had the courage to let it. The closing session ended at 6:30 p.m. with champagne toasts and congratulations that felt hollow to Daniel as he watched Elena navigate the room with practiced efficiency, never once looking in his direction. She moved from conversation to conversation with the same controlled grace she brought to everything, and Daniel wondered if he'd imagined the vulnerability she'd shown in his room the night before. Maybe it had been a moment of weakness she now regretted. Maybe the professional boundaries she'd mentioned were already being reconstructed, brick by careful brick. He was nursing his second glass of champagne and contemplating a quiet retreat to his room when Margaret appeared at his elbow. "She wants to see you," Margaret said quietly. "The North Terrace. 20 minutes." Daniel's heart kicked against his ribs. "Did she say what about?" "No," Margaret said, studying his face with concern. "But Daniel? Whatever happens tonight, remember that Elena has spent 10 years building something that could be destroyed by one mistake. Don't be that mistake." The warning settled like ice in his chest, but Daniel nodded. "I understand." "I don't think you do," Margaret said gently, "but I hope I'm wrong." The North Terrace was on the lodge's opposite side, away from the main gathering spaces, accessible through a hallway lined with landscape paintings and the muted sounds of the celebration he was leaving behind. Daniel found it empty when he arrived, just a semicircular stone platform jutting out over the lake, illuminated by strings of Edison bulbs that cast everything in warm, intimate light. He stood at the railing and tried to organize his thoughts into something coherent, but his mind kept returning to Elena's words from the night before. "I'm not oblivious to the lines we're approaching," as if they hadn't already crossed them the moment she'd stood in his room and admitted that her interest had become something more than professional. "You were brilliant today." Elena's voice came from the terrace entrance, and Daniel turned to find her silhouetted against the interior light. She'd changed from her business attire into dark slacks and a cream-colored sweater that made her look softer, more approachable, and infinitely more dangerous to his already compromised judgment. "Thank you," Daniel said as she approached. "Though I think we both know the work spoke for itself." "It did," Elena agreed, stopping a few feet away. "Which is why this conversation is necessary, because you've proven you belong at Vaughn Meridian. You've earned your place through exceptional work and genuine strategic insight. What happens next depends on whether we can maintain appropriate professional boundaries." "Is that what you came here to tell me?" Daniel asked. "That we need to pretend the past 6 weeks have been purely professional?" "No," Elena said quietly. "I came here to tell you the truth, all of it, because you deserve that much before we decide what happens next." Daniel waited, watching emotions move across Elena's face that he'd never seen her display in any professional setting. Uncertainty, conflict, something that looked almost like fear. "I knew about your application discrepancy from the beginning," Elena said finally. "Our background check flagged it the same day HR sent you the offer letter. No degree from University of Illinois, Chicago. No degree at all, in fact." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. "Then why—" "Because I read your application essay," Elena interrupted. "The one where you explained why you wanted to work in strategic consulting. You wrote about seeing patterns that others missed, about understanding how small decisions cascade into major outcomes, about wanting to prove that intelligence and insight weren't limited to people with expensive educations and family connections. She paused. And you wrote about your daughter, about wanting to show her that where you start doesn't determine where you can go. Daniel's throat tightened. He'd written that essay at 2 a.m. in his kitchen, pouring everything he believed into words that he'd been certain no one would actually read. That essay told me more about your potential than any degree could, Elena continued. So I made a decision that went against every hiring protocol we have. I overruled HR's recommendation to withdraw the offer. I told them the background check had been satisfied, and I brought you in anyway. You lied for me, Daniel said, struggling to process this revelation. I made a strategic decision based on potential rather than credentials, Elena corrected, which is either the best judgment call I've ever made or a massive ethical compromise, depending on how you look at it. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand what's at stake, Elena said, taking a step closer. If anyone discovers what I did, if it comes out that I knowingly hired someone who falsified their credentials, it doesn't just compromise me professionally, it undermines everything Vaughn Meridian stands for. Our reputation is built on unimpeachable standards and ethical integrity. One scandal like this could destroy client trust that took a decade to build. Then why take the risk? Daniel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Because when I read your essay, I saw myself, Elena said softly. Not the person I am now, but who I was at 22 when I was starting this company with inheritance money, and everyone telling me I was too young, too inexperienced, too female to succeed. I saw someone who understood that merit and potential don't always come with the right pedigree. And I wanted to prove that I could recognize genuine talent even when it arrived in an unconventional package. That's a professional justification, Daniel said, but we both know there's more to it than that. Elena's expression shifted, acknowledgement and resistance fighting for dominance. Yes, she admitted, there's more to it. From the first week, I found myself paying attention to you in ways that went beyond professional interest, the way you approached problems, the resilience you showed when I pushed you harder than anyone else, the quiet dignity with which you balanced single parenthood and a demanding job without ever using it as an excuse. Elena, let me finish, she said, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. I told myself it was mentorship, that I was investing in your potential the way I wish someone had invested in mine. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. I started looking forward to your reports not because of the analysis, but because it meant another opportunity to engage with how you think. I found myself manufacturing reasons to extend our meetings. And last night, she paused, meeting his gaze directly. Last night I came to your room knowing I shouldn't, knowing it crossed lines I've spent my entire career maintaining, because the thought of spending another day pretending this was purely professional had become unbearable. The confession hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying in its implications. So what do we do? Daniel asked quietly. Because I can't go back to pretending I don't feel this, whatever this is. That's the problem, Elena said, because there's no scenario where this doesn't have consequences. If we act on this, if we allow whatever's developing between us to become something real, we're not just risking our professional reputations. We're risking everything I've built, everything you've worked for, and we're doing it in a context where I hold all the power and you're still trying to prove you belong. You don't hold all the power, Daniel said, taking a step closer. Not in this. Maybe in the office, but right here, right now. We're just two people trying to figure out if what we feel is worth the risk. And what do you feel, Daniel? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel could have retreated, could have given her the safe answer that would allow them both to step back from this precipice. Instead, he chose honesty. I feel like I've spent 6 weeks being seen in a way I've never been seen before, he said. Not just my work, but who I am, the way I think, the things I value. You've challenged me and pushed me and believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. And somewhere in all of that, I stopped seeing you as just my boss and started seeing you as someone I wanted to know beyond the office walls. Elena's breath caught audibly. This is dangerous. I know. It could destroy both of us. I know that too. Then why are you still standing here? Elena asked. and Daniel could see her fighting against something she wanted but knew she shouldn't take. "Because I'm tired of playing it safe," Daniel said. "I spent 6 years working in a warehouse, telling myself I was being responsible and practical when really I was just scared to take risks. Then I took one chance, one application to a job I had no business applying for, and it changed everything. Maybe this is another one of those moments where the safe choice is actually the wrong choice. Or maybe it's a moment where we both need to think clearly about consequences," Elena countered, but her resolve was cracking. Daniel could see it in the way she was looking at him, like she was memorizing details in case this was the last time she allowed herself to be this close. "I have thought about the consequences," Daniel said, "and here's what I know. If we walk away from this right now, we'll spend the next year pretending there's nothing between us while everyone around us sees exactly what we're trying to hide. We'll maintain professional boundaries while the tension builds until it becomes unbearable. And eventually one of us will leave because working together while denying this will be more painful than walking away entirely." "You've given this a lot of thought," Elena said, a slight tremor in her voice. "I haven't been able to think about anything else since you left my room last night." Elena closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, Daniel saw the exact moment her carefully maintained control began to slip. "I've spent 10 years building walls between my professional and personal life. I don't let people get close. I don't allow emotions to compromise my judgment. I've made those choices deliberately because I watched what happened to other female executives who were perceived as emotional or unprofessional. I can't afford those perceptions." "I'm not asking you to compromise your professional standards," Daniel said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that what's happening between us is real, that it exists, and that maybe, just maybe, we can figure out how to navigate it without destroying everything you've built." "How?" Elena asked, and the vulnerability in that single word nearly broke Daniel's heart. "How do we navigate this when I'm your boss? When you're still establishing yourself in the company? When any relationship between us would be scrutinized and judged and potentially used to undermine both our credibility?" "Carefully," Daniel said. "Honestly, with the same strategic thinking you apply to everything else. You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Daniel agreed. "It's probably the most complicated thing either of us will ever try to navigate, but that doesn't make it impossible." Elena stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel watched her wrestle with a decision that clearly went against every instinct she'd honed over a decade of ruthless professional discipline. Finally, she said, "If we do this, and I'm not saying we should, but if we do, there have to be rules, absolute boundaries that we don't cross." "What kind of boundaries?" "Nothing at the office," Elena said immediately. "No personal conversations during business hours. No special treatment in assignments or performance reviews. Complete separation between professional and personal contexts." "That's going to be difficult," Daniel said. "We work together every day." "Which is exactly why the boundaries need to be absolute," Elena insisted. "Because the moment people perceive that our personal relationship is affecting professional decisions, we lose all credibility. You become the employee who's sleeping with the boss for advancement. I become the CEO who compromised her standards for—" She broke off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "For what?" Daniel pressed gently. "For someone I have no business wanting," Elena said quietly. "For someone 12 years younger than me. For an employee who's still building his career while I'm running a company. For a single father with complications I have no experience navigating. For—" Her voice caught. "For you." The confession stripped away the last of Daniel's hesitation. He closed the remaining distance between them, and Elena's breath hitched, but she didn't step back. "Tell me to leave," Daniel said softly. "Tell me this is a mistake, and we need to maintain professional boundaries, and I'll go back to my room right now. I'll spend the rest of my career at Vaughn Meridian being the best analyst you've ever hired, and we'll never speak about this again." "I should tell you to leave," Elena said, but she didn't move. "But you're not going to, are you?" Elena met his gaze, and Daniel saw the exact moment she stopped fighting. "No," she whispered. "I'm not." The kiss happened slowly, carefully, like they were both aware they were crossing a threshold that would change everything. Elena's hand came up to rest against Daniel's chest, and he could feel his heart hammering beneath her palm. Her lips were soft and warm, and the kiss carried the weight of 6 weeks of tension and denial, and the dangerous acknowledgement that what existed between them had moved far beyond anything professional. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder than the kiss warranted, Elena rested her forehead against his and said, "We're making a terrible decision." "Probably," Daniel agreed, "but it's ours to make." "There will be consequences," Elena said. "Complications we can't anticipate. Judgments from people who matter. Professional risks that could destroy both our careers." "I know." "And you're still willing to do this?" Daniel pulled back enough to look at her directly. "I spent 6 years playing it safe and being miserable. I'd rather take this risk with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." Something shifted in Elena's expression. Acceptance, maybe, or resignation to something she'd been fighting against since the moment Daniel had walked into her world. "We tell no one," she said firmly. "Not Margaret, not your colleagues, absolutely no one at the firm. What's between us stays completely separate from Vaughn Meridian." "Agreed." "And if at any point this starts affecting your work or my judgment, we stop. Immediately. No questions, no negotiations." "Understood." "I'm serious, Daniel," Elena said, her tone carrying the same intensity she brought to strategic sessions. "The first time I show you favoritism in an assignment, the first time you expect special treatment because of our relationship, the first time anyone at that firm suspects that personal feelings are compromising professional standards, we end this. Completely and permanently." "I wouldn't ask for special treatment," Daniel said. "That's not what this is about." "It's never about that in the beginning," Elena said quietly. "But relationships change how we see each other, how we make decisions. I need to know you understand that what we're doing is potentially destructive to everything we've both worked for." "I understand," Daniel said, "but I also understand that some things are worth the risk." Elena studied his face in the soft light from the Edison bulbs, and Daniel wondered what she saw. A promising analyst making a career-limiting decision? A complication she should have avoided? Or maybe, hopefully, someone who saw her as more than just the brilliant, intimidating CEO everyone else treated with reverent fear. "We go slowly," Elena said finally, "carefully. We figure out what this is before we make any decisions about what it could become." "That works for me." "And you need to think very carefully about what you're signing up for," Elena continued. "Because I'm not easy, Daniel. I'm demanding and controlled and constitutionally incapable of separating my personal and professional perfectionism. I will push you even when we're not at the office. I will have opinions about everything, and I will expect you to challenge me the same way I challenge you." "That doesn't sound like a warning," Daniel said with a slight smile. "That sounds like exactly what I need." Elena's expression softened. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Can it be both?" For the first time since this conversation began, Elena laughed. A genuine, unguarded sound that transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it can." They stood there on the North Terrace for another hour, talking about everything except work. Elena told him about growing up in Boston, about the pressure of family expectations and the relief of escaping to Chicago to build something entirely her own. Daniel told her about Maya, about the complicated years after his daughter's mother left, about learning to be both parents while trying to build a life that could support them both. And somewhere in that conversation, the distance between boss and employee, between someone who'd built an empire and someone still trying to prove he belonged, began to dissolve into something more fundamental. Two people finding unexpected connection in the space between who they were professionally and who they might become together. "I should go," Elena said finally, though she made no move to leave. "People will notice if we're both absent for too long." "Then we go back separately," Daniel said. "You first. I'll wait 15 minutes. Elena nodded, but before she left, she reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers trailing along his jaw. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For being brave enough to say what I couldn't, for pushing past my defenses, for—" She paused, searching for words. "For seeing me as something more than just the demanding CEO everyone else is terrified of." "I was terrified of you too," Daniel admitted. "That first week? I was convinced you were trying to force me out." "I was trying to force you to be better," Elena corrected. "There's a difference." "I know that now." Elena smiled, then stepped back, her professional mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. 15 minutes, Daniel. Then you come back to the reception and we pretend this conversation never happened. Until when? Until we're back in Chicago and we can figure out what this looks like outside the bubble of a corporate retreat, Elena said. We do this right or we don't do it at all. Then she was gone, disappearing back into the lodge and leaving Daniel alone on the terrace with a heart rate that refused to settle and the growing certainty that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He waited the full 15 minutes, using the time to try to organize his thoughts into something resembling coherence. Then he returned to the reception, accepting congratulations on his presentation and engaging in conversations about market trends and client strategies, while part of his mind remained on the North Terrace, replaying every word Elena had said. Across the room, Elena moved through conversations with the same controlled efficiency she always displayed, giving no indication that anything significant had happened. But twice, Daniel caught her looking in his direction, and the brief connection of their gazes carried everything they weren't saying aloud. The weekend concluded Sunday morning with a final strategy session that felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had transpired. Daniel presented one last analysis, received positive feedback from senior partners, and carefully avoided any direct interaction with Elena that might draw attention. The car ride back to Chicago should have been relaxing, a chance to decompress after an intense weekend. Instead, Daniel spent the entire 2 hours thinking about everything that had changed and everything that remained uncertain. He'd crossed a line with Elena Vaughn that could either lead to something meaningful or destroy everything he'd worked for. The smart choice would have been to maintain professional boundaries, to appreciate her mentorship without complicating it with personal feelings. But Daniel was beginning to understand that the smart choice and the right choice weren't always the same thing. Marcus dropped him off at his apartment in Bridgeport at 2:30 p.m., and Maya practically tackled him at the door, chattering about Mrs. Rodriguez's pancakes and the movie they'd watched, and how she'd done all her homework without being reminded even once. Daniel held his daughter close and tried to reconcile the two versions of his life. The one where he was a single father in a studio apartment in Bridgeport, and the one where he'd just spent a weekend at a luxury lodge kissing a billionaire CEO on a private terrace. Both were real. Both mattered. And somehow he was going to have to find a way to make them coexist without destroying either. "Dad?" Maya said, pulling back to look at him with concern. "You okay? You look weird." "Just tired," Daniel said, managing a smile. "It was a long weekend." "Did you bring me the fancy soap?" Daniel pulled 3 small bottles from his bag, shampoo, conditioner, and body wash from the lodge, all wrapped in expensive packaging that Maya examined with delight. "These smell like flowers," she declared. "Can I use them tonight?" "Sure, kiddo." Maya ran to the bathroom to add her treasures to their collection of hotel toiletries, and Daniel sank onto their worn couch, finally allowing the exhaustion of the weekend to catch up with him. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that he now recognized as Elena's personal line. "Made it back safely?" Daniel typed, "Just got home. Maya's already claimed the hotel toiletries." The response came quickly. "That's what they're there for. Get some rest. Tomorrow we're back to professional boundaries. Tonight, I just wanted to make sure you arrived safely." Daniel stared at the message, feeling the weight of everything they were attempting to navigate. Professional distance during business hours, careful privacy outside the office, a relationship that would require them to be 2 different versions of themselves depending on context. He typed back, "This is going to be complicated, isn't it?" Elena's response took longer this time. "Yes, but I think it might be worth it. Sleep well, Daniel." Daniel set down his phone and closed his eyes, listening to Maya sing in the bathroom while she organized her new collection of fancy soaps. Tomorrow, he'd go back to being senior analyst Daniel Hayes, proving himself in a world that had no idea he was romantically involved with the CEO. He'd maintain professional boundaries, deliver exceptional work, and carefully separate his personal and professional lives in ways that felt impossible but necessary. But tonight, just for a few hours, he allowed himself to be simply Daniel, a man who'd taken an enormous risk on a terrace overlooking Lake Geneva, who'd kissed someone he had no business wanting, and who was beginning to understand that the most meaningful connections often grew in the spaces between what was allowed and what was inevitable. Tomorrow would bring complications he couldn't anticipate and challenges he wasn't prepared for. But tomorrow could wait. Monday morning arrived with the weight of everything unsaid. Daniel stood in the Vaughn Meridian lobby at 6:45 a.m., watching early arrivals filter through the revolving doors, and tried to prepare himself for the careful performance that would define his workday. Professional distance, appropriate boundaries. No indication that anything had changed between him and the woman who ran this company. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt longer than usual, and when Daniel reached his desk, he found something that made his carefully constructed composure falter. A cup of coffee sat waiting, still steaming, positioned exactly where he always placed his morning drink. Not unusual in itself. Colleagues sometimes brought each other coffee. But this was from the artisan shop 3 blocks away, the expensive place where a single cup cost more than Daniel had been willing to spend before his promotion. And it was prepared exactly the way he preferred it. Dark roast, no sugar, just a splash of cream. No note, no explanation, just coffee that someone had gone out of their way to acquire and deliver before he'd even arrived. Daniel picked up the cup and found his hand trembling slightly. "Secret admirer?" James asked, appearing beside his desk with his own considerably less fancy coffee. "Just someone being nice," Daniel said, forcing his voice to remain casual even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Right," James said, his tone suggesting he didn't entirely believe that. "Well, whoever it is has good taste. That place doesn't mess around with their roasts." Daniel took a sip and tried not to think about Elena standing in line at an artisan coffee shop at some ungodly hour, remembering exactly how he took his coffee, making sure it arrived at his desk before he did. It was a small gesture. Insignificant, really, except that it was also deeply personal in a way that violated every boundary they'd agreed to maintain. His phone buzzed with a text. "Don't read anything into the coffee. I was already there for my own. Yours was convenient, not significant." Daniel fought back a smile and typed, "Understood. Thank you for the convenience." The response came immediately. "You're welcome. Now focus on work. The Mitchell report is due Thursday, and I expect your usual thoroughness." Professional, distant, exactly what they'd agreed to, except that the coffee sitting on his desk and the warmth in his chest suggested that maintaining boundaries was going to be significantly more difficult than either of them had anticipated. The week that followed established a pattern that was equal parts exhilarating and exhausting. During business hours, Daniel and Elena maintained absolute professional separation. In meetings, she treated him exactly the same as every other senior analyst, demanding, critical, and completely impartial. She assigned him challenging projects, tore apart his initial drafts with surgical precision, and pushed him toward better thinking without a single indication that their relationship extended beyond the office walls. But small things kept appearing that told a different story. On Tuesday, Daniel found a book on his desk, a recently published analysis of emerging market dynamics that he'd mentioned wanting to read during their conversation at Lake Geneva. No note, but the bookmark placed at Chapter 3 suggested Elena had already started it and thought he'd appreciate the same insights. On Wednesday, his presentation file for the Mitchell report mysteriously reorganized itself overnight, with subtle structural improvements that made his arguments flow more logically. The revision history showed only his name, but Daniel recognized Elena's analytical approach in the changes. On Thursday afternoon, he received an email from HR. "Your daughter has been added to the company's dependent health insurance effective immediately. Premium difference will be deducted from your next paycheck." Daniel stared at the message, calculating the cost difference and realizing it was significantly less than the private insurance he'd been struggling to afford. Someone with authority had apparently decided Maya qualified for coverage that technically required a waiting period he hadn't yet completed. He texted Elena, "Did you have something to do with Maya's insurance approval?" The response was immediate and characteristically deflective. "HR makes those decisions based on company policy. I don't involve myself in benefits administration." Daniel knew that was technically true and also complete evasion. He typed, "Thank you anyway. Focus on your report, Mr. Hayes. Professional boundaries, remember?" But the coffee kept appearing every morning, always prepared exactly right, always positioned where he'd find it first thing. And Daniel found himself looking forward to those small gestures more than he wanted to admit. Evidence that Elena was thinking about him even as they both pretended nothing had changed. The Mitchell report presentation happened Friday afternoon in the main conference room with senior partners and the client attending via video conference. Daniel delivered his analysis with the confidence born from Elena's relentless feedback and Margaret's quiet coaching, and when he finished, the client's CEO actually applauded. "That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we hired Von Meridian to provide," she said. "Hayes, I'm impressed. Elena, you've got a good one here." Across the conference table, Elena's expression remained professionally neutral. "Mr. Hayes has demonstrated significant growth over the past 2 months. I expect his trajectory will continue to be promising." The words were appropriate, measured, and completely devoid of the personal investment Daniel knew she felt. But when the meeting concluded and people began filing out, Elena caught his eye for exactly half a second, and the pride Daniel saw there was worth more than any public praise. That evening, his phone buzzed at 7:43 p.m. after he'd put Maya to bed and was reviewing notes for Monday's project kickoff. "You were exceptional today. I wanted to tell you that when everyone else could hear it, but professional boundaries." Daniel smiled at his phone and typed, "I know. It's okay. Your feedback during prep was more valuable than public praise anyway." "Good. Because you're going to get a lot more of that feedback. I'm assigning you to the Riverside Development Project. It's high profile, complex, and will probably consume the next 6 weeks of your life." "Sounds perfect." "It also means we'll be working closely together. Strategy sessions, client meetings, late nights reviewing proposals. Can you handle that while maintaining appropriate professional distance?" Daniel considered the question honestly. Could he spend 6 weeks working intensively with Elena while pretending their relationship was purely professional? Could he sit across from her in strategy sessions without remembering how she'd looked on that terrace at Lake Geneva, vulnerable and honest and absolutely terrifying in her openness? He typed, "I can handle it if you can." The response took longer this time. "Then we have an understanding. Monday morning, 8 a.m., conference room B. Come prepared to challenge everything." "Always do." "I know. It's one of my favorite things about you." The admission came through so quickly that Daniel suspected Elena had typed it before thinking better of it, and his next text confirmed that suspicion. "Forget I said that. Professional boundaries. See you Monday." Daniel set down his phone and tried not to dwell on the fact that Elena Vaughn had just admitted, however briefly, that she had favorite things about him. That somewhere beneath the demanding CEO who tore apart his work with surgical precision was someone who genuinely cared about him in ways that transcended professional mentorship. The weekend passed with the strange duality that had become Daniel's new normal. On Saturday, he took Maya to the Museum of Science and Industry, letting her drag him through exhibits while he checked his phone compulsively for messages that rarely came. Elena had said they needed complete separation between professional and personal contexts, which apparently meant minimal contact during weekends when work didn't provide cover for their communication. But Sunday evening, as Daniel was helping Maya with a school project about community helpers, his phone lit up with a call from Elena's number. "Hi," he said, stepping into the kitchen for privacy while Maya colored a drawing of a firefighter. "I'm sorry for calling," Elena said, and she sounded tired in a way Daniel had never heard before. "I know we said weekends were off limits unless it was work-related, but I needed to hear your voice." Daniel's chest tightened. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Elena said, then corrected herself. "Everything's wrong, actually. I spent the entire weekend at a family obligation in Boston, surrounded by people who think I should be married with children by now, instead of running a company. My mother spent 2 hours explaining why my priorities are destroying my chances at happiness. And I couldn't say anything because... How do I explain that I'm... She stopped abruptly. "That you're what?" Daniel prompted gently. "That I'm involved with someone who makes me question every professional boundary I've ever maintained," Elena finished quietly. "Someone who's 12 years younger than me, who's still building his career while I'm supposedly at my peak, who has a 7-year-old daughter I have no business being part of." "You're not part of Maya's life," Daniel said carefully. "We agreed to keep this completely separate from—" "I know what we agreed to," Elena interrupted. "But Daniel, I've spent the past 2 months investing in your success partly because you're brilliant, and partly because I can't seem to stop thinking about you. And this weekend, sitting through endless family dinners and professional networking events where everyone assumes I'm married to my work, all I could think about was that terrace at Lake Geneva and how for 1 hour I got to be something other than the demanding CEO everyone expects me to be." Daniel leaned against his kitchen counter, processing this confession and trying to figure out what she needed from him. Do you regret what happened at the retreat? No, Elena said immediately. That's the problem. I should regret it. It was reckless and unprofessional and potentially destructive to everything I've built. But I can't bring myself to wish it hadn't happened. Then what do you need right now? Daniel asked. Silence on the other end, then, I need to know I'm not alone in feeling like this is becoming more complicated than either of us anticipated. That you're struggling with the boundaries too. That I'm not the only one who finds the professional distance excruciating. You're not alone, Daniel said quietly. Every morning when I find coffee on my desk, I want to walk into your office and tell you that it matters. That I notice. That those small gestures mean more to me than you probably realize. And in meetings when you're tearing apart my work, part of me wants to remind everyone in that room that I've seen you vulnerable and honest and absolutely terrifying in your openness. But you don't say anything, Elena said, because we agreed to boundaries, because your reputation matters, because I understand what's at stake if anyone discovers what's happening between us. Sometimes I think the boundaries are making this harder, Elena admitted. We're so focused on hiding what we feel that we can't actually figure out what this relationship is or could become. What are you suggesting? Elena was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Maybe we need to actually spend time together outside of work. Real time. Not stolen moments on terraces or text messages late at night. Somewhere we can just be ourselves without performance or professional masks. That's risky, Daniel said. What if someone sees us? Then we're two colleagues having dinner, Elena said. Nothing inappropriate about that. Senior executives mentor junior staff all the time. We just need to be careful about where and when. Daniel thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the complications they'd agreed to avoid. But he also thought about Elena's voice on the phone, tired and vulnerable and needing something he was uniquely positioned to provide. Okay, he said. When? Tuesday night, Elena said quickly, like she'd already planned this. There's a restaurant in Evanston that's far enough from the financial district that we're unlikely to run into colleagues. Nothing fancy, just good food and conversation without anyone watching. What time? 7. I'll text you the address. Elena paused. And Daniel? Don't dress like you're going to a business meeting. Wear something that makes you comfortable, not professional. After they hung up, Daniel stood in his kitchen trying to process what had just been arranged. A dinner with Elena Vaughn. Not a business meal. Not a strategy session. An actual date, even if neither of them was willing to call it that yet. Dad? Maya's voice came from the living room. I finished the firefighter. Can you help me with the police officer? Daniel returned to the table and helped his daughter color, trying not to think about how his two worlds were becoming increasingly difficult to keep separate. Maya knew nothing about Elena beyond the vague mentions of his boss who expected a lot from him. And Elena knew about Maya only through the stories Daniel had shared, an abstract concept rather than the very real 7-year-old currently explaining why police officers needed bigger badges so people could see them better. Eventually, those worlds would have to intersect. But for now, Daniel was grateful for the separation that kept things simple in at least one area of his increasingly complicated life. Monday's project kickoff meeting for the Riverside development lasted 3 hours, with Elena leading a strategy session that was simultaneously brilliant and exhausting. She pushed the team through scenario after scenario, identifying weaknesses in their approach and demanding better thinking at every turn. And when Daniel offered an insight about potential regulatory complications, Elena spent 20 minutes building on his observation until it became a central pillar of their strategy. It was pure professional collaboration, and watching Elena in her element reminded Daniel why he'd been so intimidated by her initially. She was ruthlessly intelligent, completely focused, and absolutely relentless in her pursuit of excellence. But afterward, as the team filtered out, Elena lingered until they were alone. That observation about regulatory complications was exactly what we needed, she said, her tone softening from its professional edge. Thank you for speaking up. Just doing my job, Daniel said. No, Elena corrected. You're doing exceptional work, and I need you to know that my feedback in meetings isn't personal criticism. It's, I know what it is, Daniel interrupted gently. It's you pushing me to be better. I figured that out by now. Elena smiled slightly. Good. Because tomorrow night, when we have dinner, I don't want to spend the entire time worrying that you think I'm too demanding. Tomorrow night, Daniel said. I'm not thinking about you as my boss. I'm thinking about you as someone I want to get to know better. That's probably dangerous, Elena said, but she didn't sound like she wanted him to disagree. Probably, Daniel agreed, but we're doing it anyway. Tuesday evening found Daniel standing outside a small Italian restaurant in Evanston, dressed in dark jeans and the one nice sweater he owned that wasn't part of his work wardrobe. He told Maya he had to work dinner and arranged for Mrs. Rodriguez to watch her, hating the lie but not knowing how else to explain where he was going. Elena arrived exactly on time, emerging from a car service in casual slacks and a soft gray blouse that made her look years younger than the severe business attire she wore to the office. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked almost nervous. "Hi," she said, and the simple greeting carried more weight than it should have. "Hi," Daniel replied. "You look different." "Good different or concerning different?" "Beautiful different," Daniel said honestly, and watched Elena's expression shift with something that looked like surprise and pleasure. The restaurant was small and dimly lit, with maybe 15 tables and the kind of authentic Italian cooking that Elena claimed was impossible to find in Chicago. They were seated in a corner booth that offered privacy without feeling deliberately hidden, and for the first few minutes they navigated the awkwardness of being together without professional context. "I don't actually know how to do this," Elena admitted after they'd ordered. "The personal conversation part. I've spent so many years keeping everything professional that I'm not sure I remember how to just be myself with someone." "Then let's start simple," Daniel suggested. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with Vaughn Meridian." Elena considered this for a moment, then said, "I play piano. Not well and not often, but I have one in my apartment that I bought 6 years ago and barely use. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I'll sit there and work through pieces I learned as a teenager. It's the only time I allow myself to be mediocre at something." Daniel smiled. "That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know, something more," he searched for the right word, "impressive?" "Playing Chopin badly at 2 a.m. isn't impressive," Elena said. "It's self-indulgent and probably annoying to my neighbors, but it reminds me that perfection isn't actually necessary for something to be worthwhile." "I'd like to hear you play sometime," Daniel said. Elena's expression shifted. "That would require you coming to my apartment, which feels like crossing a line we probably shouldn't cross yet." "Yet," Daniel noted. "That implies you're thinking about eventually." "I'm thinking about a lot of things I probably shouldn't," Elena admitted, "like how much I enjoyed working with you yesterday, even though I was supposed to be maintaining professional distance. Like how difficult it was not to text you last night when I read an article that reminded me of your analysis from the Mitchell report. Like how sitting here right now feels both terrifying and exactly right in ways I can't adequately explain." Their food arrived, providing a temporary reprieve from the intensity of the conversation. But as they ate, the discussion deepened into territory that felt increasingly personal and vulnerable. Elena talked about the pressure of being a female CEO in an industry dominated by men who questioned her authority constantly. About the loneliness of success when every relationship felt transactional or competitive. About choosing to build a company instead of the family her parents had expected, and the quiet grief that sometimes accompanied that choice. Daniel talked about Maya, about the fear and responsibility of single parenthood, about the shame he'd felt working in the warehouse when he knew he was capable of more, about the lie on his application that still haunted him, even knowing Elena had seen through it from the beginning. "Do you ever regret hiring me?" Daniel asked. "Knowing what you knew about my credentials?" Elena set down her wine glass and looked at him directly. "No, I regret that our system makes credentials more important than capability. I regret that brilliant people get overlooked because they don't have the right pedigree. But hiring you, that's one of the best decisions I've made in years. Even knowing it could compromise everything if the truth came out?" "Even knowing that," Elena confirmed, "because you've proven exactly what I believed about potential versus credentials. And because—" She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Because knowing you has reminded me that there's more to life than quarterly reports and strategic planning. That sometimes the most meaningful connections happen when we take risks we're not supposed to take." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and revolutionary. Elena's fingers curled around his, and for a moment they just sat there, holding hands in a corner booth in Evanston like two people discovering each other for the first time. "I don't know what we're doing," Daniel said quietly, "or where this goes, or how we navigate the impossible complexity of our professional relationship while trying to build something personal. But I know I don't want to stop." "Neither do I," Elena said, "which terrifies me more than I'm willing to admit." They stayed at the restaurant until closing, talking about everything and nothing, learning the small details that professional interactions never revealed. Elena's favorite color was deep blue because it reminded her of the ocean at dusk. Daniel had wanted to be a teacher before life got complicated and different paths became necessary. They both loved old movies and terrible puns, and the particular quiet that came with early morning before the city fully woke up. When they finally left, Elena's car service was waiting, and they stood on the sidewalk trying to figure out how to say goodnight. "I should go," Elena said, but she didn't move. "You should," Daniel agreed, also not moving. "This was nice. We should do it again." "We should, but we need to be careful. More careful than we've been." "I know." Elena looked up at him, and in the streetlight, Daniel could see conflict and desire fighting for dominance in her expression. Finally, she rose on her toes and kissed him quickly, a brief press of lips that carried the weight of everything they weren't saying. "Good night, Daniel," she said, stepping back before either of them could complicate the moment further. "Good night, Elena." He watched her car pull away, then caught the L back to Bridgeport, replaying the evening in his mind and trying to figure out how someone like him had ended up here, involved with a woman who ran a company, who challenged him intellectually, who made him want to be better while accepting exactly who he was. The next morning, coffee was waiting on his desk as usual, but this time there was a note tucked underneath. "Thank you for last night. Same time next week? E." Daniel smiled and tucked the note into his pocket, then pulled out his phone to respond. "Same time next week. I'll tell you about the time Maya convinced me that unicorns were scientifically possible." Elena's reply came immediately. "This I have to hear. Focus on work today. The Riverside client call is at 2 p.m., and I need you sharp. Professional boundaries during business hours. Carefully planned dinners where they could actually be themselves. Small gestures that bridged the gap between the two versions of their relationship." It wasn't perfect, and Daniel knew there would be complications they hadn't anticipated. But as he sat at his desk reviewing materials for the afternoon's client call, he understood with perfect clarity that some risks were worth taking, even the ones that could destroy everything, especially the ones that made him feel, for the first time in years, like he was building a life rather than just surviving one. The weeks that followed their first dinner in Evanston established a rhythm that felt sustainable until it didn't. Tuesday nights became their standing appointment, different restaurants each week, always far enough from the financial district to minimize the risk of running into colleagues. During those evenings, Daniel and Elena existed in a carefully constructed bubble where professional hierarchies dissolved, and they were simply two people learning each other's histories, preferences, and the small details that transformed attraction into something deeper. Elena told him about the year she'd spent in Paris after college, working at a consulting firm where her ideas were dismissed because of her age and gender, about the decision to return to Chicago and build something where her voice would matter, about the first client she'd landed through sheer persistence, and the terror of realizing she actually had to deliver results that justified their faith in her. Daniel shared stories about Maya's early years, about the panic of being left alone with an infant when his daughter's mother decided parenthood wasn't what she wanted, about learning to braid hair from YouTube videos and attending princess tea parties with the solemnity they deserved, about the guilt that still surfaced when he thought about all the moments he'd missed while working multiple jobs to keep them afloat. And somewhere in those conversations, between shared appetizers and debates about old movies, something fundamental shifted. They stopped being CEO and analyst who happened to be attracted to each other and became two people genuinely invested in each other's lives. But the careful separation between their professional and personal worlds created complications that neither had fully anticipated. At work, Elena maintained the same demanding standards she applied to everyone, which meant Daniel's reports still came back covered in red annotations, and his presentations faced the same surgical questioning. He understood intellectually that this was necessary, that any perception of favoritism would undermine both their credibility. But emotionally, it created a dissonance that became increasingly difficult to manage. During one particularly brutal strategy session in early December, Elena spent 20 minutes dismantling an analysis Daniel had worked on for 3 days, exposing gaps in his reasoning with the precision of a master strategist identifying fatal flaws. "You're making assumptions about market stability that aren't supported by historical precedent," she said, her tone professionally neutral. "What happens to your entire thesis if regulatory conditions shift in the next quarter?" Daniel had an answer, but before he could deliver it, James Park jumped in with a modification to the approach that addressed Elena's concern. Elena nodded approvingly and moved on, leaving Daniel with the uncomfortable awareness that he'd been about to defend flawed thinking because his ego had gotten in the way of genuine analysis. After the meeting, Margaret pulled him aside. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Fine," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Elena was tough on you in there," Margaret observed. "Tougher than necessary, maybe." "She was right about the market stability assumptions," Daniel admitted. "Being right doesn't mean it doesn't sting," Margaret said gently, especially when— She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Especially when the criticism comes from someone whose opinion matters more than it should." Daniel met her gaze and saw understanding there that made his stomach drop. "Margaret, I'm not asking questions I don't want answers to," Margaret interrupted. "But I'm telling you to be careful, because whatever's happening between you and Elena, people are starting to notice that the dynamic has changed. Maybe not what specifically, but something. And in this environment, perception matters as much as reality." The warning haunted Daniel through the rest of the day, and when he checked his phone after leaving the office, he found a text from Elena. "I'm sorry about the meeting. I pushed too hard. Can we talk tonight?" Daniel typed back, "Maya has a school concert. I'll be there until 8. The response came immediately. "I'd like to come, if that's okay. I want to see this part of your life." Daniel stared at the message, his heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and alarm. Elena meeting Maya meant crossing a threshold they'd carefully avoided. It meant acknowledging that their relationship existed beyond Tuesday dinners and professional collaboration. It meant complications he wasn't sure either of them was ready to navigate. But it also meant something he'd been wanting without knowing how to ask for it. Elena seeing him not just as the ambitious analyst or the man she had dinner with, but as a father, as someone whose life extended far beyond the office walls. He typed, "Lincoln Elementary Auditorium. Concert starts at 6:30. Maya's in the 3rd grade chorus. I'll be there." That evening, Danielle sat in the crowded elementary school auditorium, surrounded by parents with phones ready to record performances they'd watch once and never delete. Maya was in the 2nd row of the chorus, wearing the white shirt and dark pants the school had required, her face serious with the responsibility of remembering all the words to songs about winter and friendship. Daniel was scanning the program when someone slid into the empty seat beside him. "I hope I'm not late," Elena said quietly. She'd changed from her business attire into dark jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger and more approachable. She looked nervous in a way Daniel had never seen. No CEO confidence, no strategic composure, just someone hoping she hadn't made a mistake by showing up. "You're right on time," Daniel said. "She's in the 2nd row, right side, dark hair with the red headband." Elena followed his gaze and found Maya, and Daniel watched her expression soften into something tender and uncertain. "She's beautiful," Elena said. "She has your eyes." "She has her mother's everything else," Daniel replied. "But yeah, the eyes are mine." The concert began, and Daniel tried to focus on Maya's performance while being acutely aware of Elena sitting beside him. When the 3rd graders launched into an enthusiastic, if somewhat off-key rendition of Jingle Bells, Elena laughed quietly, and the sound made Daniel's chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to hope. After the concert, parents flooded the hallway outside the auditorium waiting for their children to be released. Daniel stood with Elena slightly apart from the crowd, trying to figure out how to introduce her when Maya appeared. "Dad!" Maya called, weaving through the crowd with the determined efficiency of someone who'd spent years navigating adult spaces. She launched herself at Daniel, and he caught her in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. You were amazing, Daniel said. Best performance I've ever seen. We messed up the second verse of Frosty, Maya said seriously. But Mrs. Chen said mistakes are part of performing. Mrs. Chen is very wise, Daniel said, setting Maya down and trying to figure out how to handle the introduction that was about to happen. Maya had already noticed Elena, studying her with the frank curiosity of a 7-year-old who'd learned to read adults accurately. Hi, Maya said. Are you my dad's boss? Elena crouched down to Maya's eye level, and Daniel watched something shift in her demeanor, the professional mask falling away to reveal someone genuine and a little uncertain. I am, Elena said. My name is Elena. Your dad has told me a lot about you. He talks about you too, Maya said. He says you're very smart and sometimes scary. Maya, Daniel started, but Elena laughed. Your dad is very smart too, Elena said. And he's right that I can be scary sometimes, but only when people aren't doing their best work. Are you friends? Maya asked, and the question hung in the air with implications that Daniel wasn't prepared to address. Elena glanced up at Daniel, and he saw her trying to figure out how to answer honestly without overcomplicating a child's understanding. Yes, Elena said finally. We're friends. Good, Maya said with the decisive certainty only children possess. Dad needs more friends. He mostly just works and hangs out with me. That sounds like he has his priorities right, Elena said gently. They walked out of the school together, and Daniel felt the strangeness of his two worlds colliding in an elementary school parking lot. Maya chattered about the concert and how nervous she'd been about forgetting the words, and Elena listened with genuine attention, asking questions that showed she was actually interested rather than just being polite. When they reached Daniel's car, Maya surprised him by turning to Elena and saying, Do you want to get ice cream with us? Dad always gets ice cream after concerts. Daniel's heart stopped. He looked at Elena, ready to give her an easy out, but she was looking at Maya with an expression that was equal parts surprised and pleased. I would love that, Elena said, if it's okay with your dad. It's okay, Daniel managed, even as his mind raced through all the reasons this was a terrible idea. The ice cream shop was a tiny place in Bridgeport that stayed open late despite having only 4 tables and a permanently broken freezer display light. Maya ordered her usual, chocolate with rainbow sprinkles, while Daniel got vanilla and Elena chose something adventurous with caramel and sea salt. They crowded into a corner booth, Maya between them, and Daniel watched his daughter charm Elena with stories about school and friends and the hamster in her classroom that kept escaping its cage. Elena asked questions and laughed at Maya's dramatic retellings, and Daniel saw her walls coming down in ways they never did at the office or even during their Tuesday dinners. Your dad says you're very good at math, Elena said. I like numbers, Maya said. They make sense, not like reading where words can mean different things depending on how you say them. I was the same way when I was your age, Elena said. I liked that math had right answers. Everything else felt too complicated. Does it get less complicated when you grow up? Maya asked, and the innocence of the question made both adults pause. Sometimes, Elena said carefully, but sometimes it gets more complicated in different ways. The important thing is learning to be comfortable with not always knowing the right answer. Is that what you teach my dad at work? Maya asked. How to be comfortable with not knowing. Elena met Daniel's gaze over Maya's head, and he saw tenderness there that made his breath catch. Your dad already knows that, Elena said. What I try to teach him is that he's smarter than he thinks he is, that he can trust himself even when things feel uncertain. Oh, Maya said, considering this. That's nice. He worries a lot. Maya, Daniel started, embarrassed, but Elena just smiled. It means he cares about doing things right, Elena said. That's a good quality, even if it makes him worry more than he should. They stayed at the ice cream shop until Maya started yawning. Then Daniel drove Elena back to where she'd left her car at the school. Maya had fallen asleep in the back seat, and in the quiet of the car, Elena said softly, Thank you for letting me be part of tonight. She's wonderful. She liked you, Daniel said, which is not guaranteed. Maya's usually pretty cautious with new people. I liked her too, Elena said. Seeing you with her, seeing that side of your life, it makes everything make more sense. Why you work so hard. Why you're so careful about protecting what matters. Does it change anything? Daniel asked quietly. Knowing that my life is complicated, that it's not just me but a 7-year-old who depends on me. Elena was quiet for a moment, then, it changes everything, and nothing. It makes this harder in ways I didn't fully appreciate before, but it also makes what we're building feel more real, more worth the risk. They sat in the parking lot, and Daniel wanted to kiss her but was too aware of his sleeping daughter in the back seat and the public space that offered no privacy. I should go, Elena said finally. But Daniel, thank you for trusting me with this part of your life. I know it wasn't easy. Nothing about this is easy, Daniel said, but it's worth it. The following Tuesday, their dinner was quieter than usual, both of them processing the shift that had occurred when Elena met Maya. They'd crossed a threshold neither could uncross, acknowledged that their relationship existed beyond professional boundaries and private dinners. I've been thinking, Elena said over wine that neither was drinking very quickly, about what happens next, how we navigate this without destroying everything we've both worked for. And what did you conclude? Daniel asked. That we need to be honest, Elena said. Not publicly, not yet, but with the people who matter, starting with Margaret, who already knows something's happening and deserves not to be put in a position where she has to cover for us. Daniel's stomach dropped. You want to tell Margaret? I want to tell her the truth so she can help us navigate the professional complications without compromising the company, Elena said. Margaret's been with me from the beginning. She understands better than anyone what's at stake, and I trust her judgment about how to manage this situation appropriately. What if she says we need to stop? Daniel asked quietly. Then we have a very difficult decision to make, Elena admitted. But I'd rather know now than 6 months from now when we're even more invested and the stakes are higher. They arranged to meet with Margaret the following evening, and Daniel spent the intervening time alternating between relief that they were being honest and terror about what Margaret's advice might be. Margaret listened to their explanation without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away as Elena laid out the situation. The relationship that had developed, their attempts to maintain professional boundaries, the growing awareness that separation between professional and personal contexts was becoming unsustainable. When Elena finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then said, How long? Seriously? Since Lake Geneva, Elena admitted. Emotionally? Probably since his 2nd week. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then, You realize this is exactly the kind of complication I warned you about. I know, Elena said. And you proceeded anyway. Yes. Because you couldn't help yourselves, or because you genuinely believe this is worth the risk? Elena and Daniel exchanged a glance, and Daniel said, Both. We tried to maintain boundaries. We tried to keep it professional. But somewhere along the way, this became something neither of us could walk away from. Margaret studied them both, and Daniel felt like he was being assessed by someone who could see through every defense and rationalization. Does anyone else know? Margaret asked. No, Elena said. We've been very careful. Except for Tuesday dinners at restaurants all over the Chicago suburbs, Margaret said dryly, which half the senior staff has probably noticed by now since Elena Vaughn doesn't take random evenings off for personal time. We've been discreet, Elena protested. You've been obvious, Margaret corrected. Maybe not about specifics, but about the fact that something's changed, the way you look at each other in meetings, the coffee that appears on Daniel's desk every morning. The fact that Daniel's trajectory in this company has been meteoric in ways that would raise questions, even if everyone didn't already suspect Elena has taken a particular interest in his development. Daniel felt his face heat with embarrassment and concern. We've tried to keep professional standards. I know you have, Margaret said, her tone softening. And honestly, Daniel's work is exceptional enough to justify the advancement. The problem isn't that he doesn't deserve his success. The problem is perception. If this relationship becomes public knowledge, people will question whether his promotions were earned or given, whether Elena's judgment is compromised, whether Vaughn Meridian's reputation for ethical standards is still intact. So what do we do? Elena asked quietly. Margaret was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, you have 3 options. First, you end the relationship immediately and hope the rumors die down. Second, you continue as you are and accept that eventually someone will figure it out and force a crisis. Or third, she paused. You get ahead of it. What does that mean? Daniel asked. It means you acknowledge the relationship to the board and senior partners before anyone else can use it against you, Margaret said. You establish clear boundaries about how Elena recuses herself from decisions affecting Daniel's career. You demonstrate that you're aware of the ethical complications and have systems in place to manage them. The board will lose their minds, Elena said. Probably, Margaret agreed. But they'll lose their minds more if they find out you've been hiding a relationship with an employee. At least this way you control the narrative. Elena leaned back in her chair, processing this advice. If I disclose to the board, they'll require Daniel to transfer to a different division, probably a different office entirely, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Yes, Margaret said. Most likely. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. Transfer to a different division meant losing the mentorship that had transformed his career. Different office meant potentially relocating, which was impossible with Maya settled in school and his entire support system in Bridgeport. There has to be another way, Daniel said. There probably isn't, Margaret said gently. Not if you want to protect both Elena's reputation and your own credibility. The only way this works is if you're no longer in a direct reporting relationship. Elena reached for Daniel's hand under the table, and he felt her fingers trembling slightly. I need to think about this, she said. About what we're willing to sacrifice and what we're not. They left Margaret's office in silence, and Elena drove Daniel back to Bridgeport without either of them speaking. When they reached his building, Daniel finally said, If this means you losing everything you've built, we stop, right now. I won't be the reason your reputation gets destroyed. And if it means you losing the career you've worked for, Elena countered, transferring to some satellite office where you're starting over with people who don't know your capabilities? Then we figure it out, Daniel said, because I'm not walking away from this. From you. Not unless you tell me that's what you want. Elena turned to look at him directly. I spent 10 years building Vaughn Meridian, 10 years proving I could succeed on my own terms without compromising my standards. And now I'm faced with a choice between the company I built and the first real relationship I've had that feels worth protecting. You shouldn't have to choose, Daniel said. But I do, Elena said quietly. We both do. And I need to figure out if I'm brave enough to risk everything I've built for something that's only 3 months old and might not last. The words hit harder than Daniel expected because she was right to be cautious. They were still learning each other, still figuring out if what they felt was sustainable or just the intensity of newness. And asking Elena to risk her company for a relationship that was still finding its foundation felt unfair in ways Daniel couldn't quite articulate. Take time to think, Daniel said. We don't have to decide tonight. I don't need time, Elena said, and there was something fierce in her voice. I need courage, because I already know what I want. I've known since Lake Geneva, probably since that first brutal feedback session when I saw how you responded to criticism by getting better instead of defensive. I know that what I feel for you is real and worth fighting for. What I don't know is if I'm brave enough to actually fight. You're the bravest person I know, Daniel said. I've been brave about business, Elena corrected, about building companies and taking strategic risks and proving I belong in rooms that didn't want me. But this, being vulnerable with someone who could actually hurt me? I've spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of risk. Daniel leaned across the center console and kissed her gently. And when he pulled back, he said, Then maybe it's time to take a different kind of risk. The kind where the potential reward isn't money or success, but actual happiness. Elena closed her eyes, and Daniel watched her wrestle with something fundamental. Finally, she said, I'm going to talk to the board. I'm going to tell them about us and accept whatever consequences come with that disclosure. But I need you to understand what that might mean, for both of us. I understand, Daniel said. Do you? Elena asked. Because you might end up transferred to an office in another state, or you might end up forced to choose between this relationship and your career at Vaughn Meridian. And either way, you'll be dealing with whispers and judgment and people questioning whether you earned your success or were just sleeping with the right person. Let them question, Daniel said. I know what I've earned. You know what I've earned. That's enough. Elena studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, then we do this together. We face whatever comes next as a team. The board meeting happened 2 weeks later, during which time Daniel and Elena maintained their careful professional distance, while privately preparing for every possible outcome. Elena consulted with employment attorneys about proper procedures. Daniel prepared himself for the possibility of leaving Vaughn Meridian entirely and starting over somewhere new. Margaret served as their advisor through the process, helping them understand the legal and ethical requirements while privately admitting she'd never seen Elena fight this hard for anything that wasn't directly related to the company's success. "You really love him," Margaret said to Elena the night before the board meeting. "Yes," Elena admitted, "which terrifies me more than any business challenge I've ever faced." "Good," Margaret said. "You should be terrified. It means you're actually letting yourself feel something real instead of just strategizing your way through life." The board meeting lasted 3 hours. Elena presented the situation with characteristic thoroughness, acknowledging the relationship, outlining the potential conflicts of interest, and proposing a series of measures to ensure that personal feelings didn't compromise professional judgment. She offered to recuse herself from any decisions affecting Daniel's career and suggested establishing oversight protocols that would provide additional accountability. The board's response was mixed. Some members were concerned about optics and potential liability. Others appreciated Elena's transparency and willingness to establish appropriate boundaries. The conversation circled through various scenarios and complications until finally the board chair, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd known Elena since the company's founding, said, "This is messy. It creates complications we'd all prefer to avoid, but I've watched Elena build this company through sheer determination and ethical integrity. If she says she can manage this relationship without compromising professional standards, I'm inclined to trust her judgment." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive enough. The board approved Elena's proposal with conditions. Daniel would be transferred to the firm's newly established West Coast division, reporting to a different senior partner. Elena would have no involvement in his performance reviews or compensation decisions, and both would be required to participate in ethics training about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible. Daniel stood in Elena's office after the board meeting, processing what had just happened. "West Coast Division," he said quietly. "That's Los Angeles." "Yes," Elena said, "which is completely impractical given Maya's school and your support system and everything you've built here. So we're back to impossible choices." "No," Elena said, and there was something determined in her voice. "We're back to creative problem solving. The West Coast Division needs someone to establish satellite operations in Chicago, someone who understands our culture and standards but isn't part of the existing hierarchy. It would be a senior position, significant autonomy, and it would keep you here while satisfying the board's requirement that you not report to me directly." Daniel stared at her. "You got them to create a position?" "I got them to recognize a genuine operational need that coincidentally solves our current complications," Elena corrected. "It's good business and good ethics. The fact that it also means you don't have to relocate your 7-year-old daughter is just strategic efficiency." Daniel crossed the office and pulled Elena into a kiss that was probably inappropriate for her workplace, but he didn't care. When they broke apart, he said, "You fought for this, for us?" "I fought for what I want," Elena said, "which happens to be building a life with you while maintaining the company I've spent 10 years creating. I'm not willing to sacrifice either one anymore." The transition to the new position took 6 weeks, during which Daniel finished his remaining projects in the Strategic Analysis Division and prepared to take on responsibilities that were both exciting and terrifying. He'd be building something from the ground up, establishing operations that would eventually support multiple senior analysts with autonomy that felt both liberating and overwhelming. But he wouldn't be alone in the work. Elena had made sure he'd have resources, support, and mentorship from senior partners who weren't romantically involved with him. During those weeks, something else shifted too. With the relationship no longer a secret from the people who mattered, Daniel and Elena stopped trying to maintain the exhausting performance of professional distance. They were still careful about public displays at the office, but they could have lunch together without worrying about perception. They could discuss strategy over dinner without pretending it was purely professional. They could simply be two people building something together without the constant fear of discovery. And slowly, carefully, Elena became part of Daniel and Maya's life in ways that felt natural rather than forced. She attended Maya's school winter concert and actually enjoyed it. She helped with a science project about plant growth that turned their kitchen into a temporary greenhouse. She learned to braid hair from the same YouTube videos Daniel had used years ago, and she brought books to their apartment that she thought Maya would enjoy. Maya, for her part, accepted Elena's presence with the adaptability of children who understand that families come in many configurations. She never asked if Elena was Daniel's girlfriend or tried to label the relationship. She just absorbed Elena into their small world and made room for her with the generosity that had always been her defining quality. 3 months after the board meeting, Daniel stood in the newly established Chicago satellite office for Vaughn Meridian's West Coast division, looking at the space he'd helped design and the team he was beginning to build. It wasn't the trajectory he'd imagined when he'd first applied to the company with a falsified degree and desperate hope. It was better, more responsibility, more autonomy, more opportunity to prove that merit mattered more than credentials. His phone buzzed with the text from Elena. "How's the first day in the new role?" Daniel typed back, "Terrifying and perfect. Thank you for making this possible. You made it possible by being exceptional. I just made sure people noticed." That evening, Daniel picked up Maya from school and drove to Elena's apartment in the Gold Coast, a space he'd been to exactly 3 times and still felt slightly intimidated by. Elena had made dinner, or more accurately, had ordered dinner from a restaurant and plated it to look homemade, and the 3 of them sat at her dining table like a family still figuring out its shape. "Dad's new office is really high up," Maya announced, pouring herself more water with the careful concentration of someone trying not to spill. "Like 40th floor high." 42nd floor, Daniel corrected, "and you're not supposed to be impressed by office height." "Why not?" Maya asked practically. "High offices mean important work." "Smart kid," Elena said, catching Daniel's eye with amusement. After dinner, Maya settled on Elena's couch with a book, while Daniel helped clean up. They worked in comfortable silence until Elena said quietly, "I've been thinking about what comes next. For us." Daniel's heart rate accelerated. "What comes next?" "We've been navigating this relationship in pieces," Elena said. "Careful boundaries, limited integration, always aware of professional complications. And that made sense when we were still figuring out if this was real. But Daniel..." She turned to face him fully. "This is real. What I feel for you is real. What we're building together is real. And I don't want to keep approaching it like it's temporary or conditional anymore." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to actually build a life with you," Elena said. "Not just Tuesday dinners and careful separation between professional and personal. I want mornings together and joint decisions about the future and all the complicated, messy integration that comes with actually committing to someone." Daniel set down the dish he was holding and pulled Elena close. "I want that too. I've wanted it since Lake Geneva, probably since before then, but I was afraid to ask for it because it felt like too much too fast." "It probably is too fast," Elena admitted. "We've known each other less than 6 months. We're still learning how to navigate basic relationship dynamics. And you have Maya to consider, which adds layers of complexity I'm still figuring out how to handle appropriately." "Maya loves you," Daniel said, "in case you haven't noticed." "I love her too," Elena said quietly, "which terrifies me because I have no idea how to be good at this part. I can run a company. I can make strategic decisions about multi-million-dollar engagements, but being part of a 7-year-old's life, being someone she might come to depend on, that feels like higher stakes than any business deal I've ever negotiated." "You're already good at it," Daniel said. "You show up, you pay attention, you treat her like a person whose thoughts and feelings matter. That's all she needs." Elena leaned into him, and they stood in her kitchen holding each other while Maya read on the couch, completely absorbed in her book and oblivious to the adult conversation happening 20 feet away. "Move in with me," Elena said suddenly. Daniel pulled back to look at her. "What?" "Move in with me," Elena repeated. "You and Maya. This apartment has 3 bedrooms that I barely use. Maya could have her own space that's not shared with your bedroom. You could stop paying rent on a studio in Bridgeport, and we could actually see what it's like to build a life together instead of just dating around your parenting schedule and my work obligations." "Elena, that's..." Daniel struggled to find words. "That's a huge step." "I know," Elena said. "And if it's too fast, we wait. But I'm 42 years old and I've spent my entire adult life being cautious about personal commitments. I don't want to be cautious with you. I want to take the risk and see what happens when we actually choose each other instead of just carefully navigating around complications." Daniel thought about his studio apartment in Bridgeport, about the cramped space that had been home for 6 years but had never quite felt permanent. He thought about Maya having her own bedroom, about morning routines that included someone other than just him, about building something that felt like actual family instead of just survival. "I need to talk to Maya," he said. "This affects her life as much as mine. She gets a vote." "Of course," Elena agreed immediately. They called Maya over, and she climbed into the chair between them with the slight wariness of a child who knew something important was being discussed. "Elena asked us to move in with her," Daniel said, deciding directness was better than dancing around the question. "That would mean leaving our apartment in Bridgeport and living here. You'd have your own room. We'd be closer to your school. But it's a big change, so I wanted to know how you feel about it." Maya was quiet for a moment, processing this with the seriousness she brought to all major decisions. Finally, she looked at Elena and asked, "Would you be like my mom?" The question hung in the air, and Daniel watched Elena navigate it with care. "I would be someone who loves you and wants to be part of your life," Elena said gently. "But your mom is your mom, even if she's not here right now. I wouldn't try to replace her. I'd just be Elena, who cares about you and your dad very much." "Okay," Maya said, accepting this explanation with the pragmatism that had always defined her approach to complicated adult situations. "Can I paint my room purple?" Elena laughed, surprised and delighted. "You can paint it any color you want." "Then yes," Maya declared. "I want to move here." "Dad says yes too, even if he's being slow about it." Daniel looked at his daughter, then at Elena, then back at Maya. "I guess I say yes too." The move happened over the course of 3 weeks, during which time Daniel packed up 6 years of accumulated belongings and tried to process how dramatically his life had transformed. From warehouse worker to senior analyst to living with a woman who ran a company, it felt like a story that belonged to someone else, except it was definitively, impossibly his. Maya adapted to the new apartment with the flexibility of children, claiming her purple bedroom and establishing territories with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her welcome. She left books scattered across Elena's previously pristine living room and taught Elena how to make proper hot chocolate and generally made the space feel lived in ways it never had before. And Elena, brilliant, demanding, occasionally terrifying Elena, learned how to be part of their small family with the same determined focus she brought to everything else. She attended school events and helped with homework and figured out that bedtime routines were non-negotiable even when work demanded attention. It wasn't perfect. There were adjustments and missteps and moments when the complications of blending their lives felt overwhelming, but they worked through it together, with honesty and patience and the growing certainty that what they were building was worth the effort. 6 months after moving in together, Daniel received word that the Chicago satellite office had exceeded all performance projections, and the board was considering expanding operations. His work had proven that strategic talent could be developed anywhere, that credentials mattered less than capability, and that sometimes the best hires were the ones who didn't fit traditional patterns. Elena called him into her office, the one conversation they still maintained in professional space, and said with complete professional neutrality, "The board is very pleased with the Chicago satellite's performance. They've asked me to communicate their appreciation for your leadership." "Thank you," Daniel said, matching her formal tone, even though they both knew he'd be going home to her apartment that evening. "They're also considering a proposal to expand satellite operations to 3 additional cities," Elena continued, "which would require someone to oversee the entire network. It's a vice president-level position, significant responsibility and autonomy." Daniel's breath caught. "Are you offering me a VP role?" "I'm not offering you anything," Elena corrected. "The board makes those decisions. I've recused myself from the conversation entirely to avoid any appearance of favoritism. But I wanted you to know it's being discussed, and your name is at the top of the candidate list based purely on merit and results." "When would they decide?" "Within the month," Elena said. Then dropping her professional mask slightly, she added, "You've earned this, Daniel. Everything you've accomplished here. It's because you're exceptional at what you do. Never let anyone suggest otherwise." That evening, Daniel told Maya about the potential promotion while Elena made dinner in their shared kitchen. His daughter's response was characteristically direct. "Does this mean we have to move again?" "No," Daniel said. "The position would be based here in Chicago. I'd just travel more." "Okay then," Maya said. "You should take it. You're good at your job. Elena appeared in the doorway, listening to this exchange with a slight smile. She's not wrong. You are good at your job. I learned from the best, Daniel said. You learned from being pushed beyond what you thought you were capable of, Elena corrected. I just provided the pushing. Later that night, after Maya was asleep in her purple bedroom, Daniel and Elena stood on the apartment's balcony looking out at Chicago's skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly, and Daniel thought about how far he'd come from that first terrifying day in the break room when Elena had looked at him with an intensity that had made him certain he was about to be fired. I never thanked you properly, Daniel said quietly. For what? For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. For pushing me to be better. For taking a risk on someone who had no business being hired at Vaughn Meridian. Elena turned to face him, and in the dim light from the apartment, Daniel could see the softness that had gradually replaced her professional armor when they were alone together. I didn't take a risk on you, Elena said. I made a strategic decision based on potential. Everything that's happened since then, the success, the growth, Geet, the promotion you're about to receive, that's all you. I just made sure you had the opportunity to prove what you were capable of. And what about this? Daniel asked, gesturing between them. What about us? Was that strategic too? No, Elena admitted. This was the opposite of strategic. This was me letting my guard down and allowing myself to want something that had nothing to do with business success or professional achievement. This was me being brave enough to choose happiness, even when it came with complications I couldn't control. Daniel pulled her close, and they stood there on the balcony holding each other while the city hummed below them, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something real from professional scrutiny and impossible odds. I love you, Daniel said, the words emerging easily because they'd been true for months, even if he'd been too cautious to say them aloud. I love you too, Elena replied, which is still slightly terrifying, but also the best decision I've made in years. They went back inside to find Maya had woken up and was sitting on the couch in her pajamas, looking sleepy and young and completely content. Can't sleep? Daniel asked, settling beside her. Just wanted to make sure you were both still here, Maya said, the admission revealing the insecurity that still surfaced sometimes despite the stability they'd built. We're here, Elena said, sitting on Maya's other side. We're not going anywhere. Maya leaned against Elena with the trust of a child who'd learned that some adults actually stayed. And Daniel watched his daughter find comfort in the woman who'd transformed his life in ways he was still processing. This was what he'd been fighting for all along, he realized. Not just professional success or financial stability, but the opportunity to build a life that felt whole. A family that existed not because of obligation or desperation, but because they'd all chosen each other deliberately and completely. 3 weeks later, the board officially offered Daniel the vice president position, and he accepted with the confidence of someone who'd finally learned to trust his own capabilities. The promotion came with responsibilities that would challenge him, and growth opportunities that excited him, and the validation that his success had been earned through merit rather than connections. But more importantly, it came with the certainty that he'd found where he belonged, not just professionally, but personally. In a city that had once seemed impossibly vast and unwelcoming, in a company he'd had no business applying to, in a relationship that had started with brutal criticism and evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, but both were committed to protecting. That evening, they celebrated with dinner at the same Italian restaurant in Evanston where they'd had their first official date. Maya came with them this time, and they sat in the same corner booth that had hosted so many important conversations, marking how far they'd come from careful boundaries and professional distance. To new beginnings, Elena said, raising her water glass. To taking risks, Daniel added. To purple bedrooms, Maya contributed, making them both laugh. They clinked glasses and smiled at each other. Three people who'd built a family from impossible odds and refused to let complications destroy what they were creating together. And later that night, after Maya was asleep and Daniel and Elena were finally alone, they stood in their bedroom and acknowledged what they'd both known for months, but had been too cautious to fully embrace. This was it. This was the life they'd chosen. Messy and complicated and absolutely worth every risk they'd taken to get here. No regrets? Elena asked quietly. Not one, Daniel said. You? Just that I didn't let myself do this sooner, Elena admitted. That I spent so many years being cautious when I could have been building something real. We're building it now, Daniel said. That's what matters. And outside their window, Chicago continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to the quiet revolution happening in a Gold Coast apartment where a single father and a billionaire CEO had proven that sometimes the most unlikely connections created the strongest foundations, and that courage wasn't about avoiding risk, but about choosing what mattered despite the complications. They'd both learned that lesson the hard way, through brutal feedback and impossible standards, and the gradual recognition that what had started as professional mentorship had evolved into something far more meaningful. Now they just had to keep building on that foundation, one day at a time, with honesty and patience and the absolute certainty that some things, some people, were worth fighting for no matter how complicated the journey became.